Have you ever met someone who completely messed up your life? For the better? The morning started like any other in the busy art gallery, LA Horizons, a sophisticated space revered by critics and art lovers. Sarah Carter walked through the impeccably lit hallways, where works by renowned artists were displayed like trophies from an elitist cultural world. His attentive eye analyzed every detail, from the paintings to the sculptures, ensuring that everything was in perfect order before the official opening. To any observer, Sarah was the embodiment of professionalism, serious, meticulous, and extremely committed to what she did. But few could imagine the secret she guarded so carefully. Sarah maintained a double life. After hours, she was the administrator of one of the largest fan pages dedicated to Alex Reyes, a world-famous actor and musician. Under the pseudonym ArtSoul98, she dedicated herself to posting never-before-seen photos, organizing polls, and even leading fundraising campaigns for charitable causes that Alex supported. This parallel life was a refuge, something that kept her connected to a lighter world, where she could be whoever she wanted, without the pressures of the sophisticated artistic environment in which she worked. But this carefully balanced routine was about to change. On that particular day, as Sarah was adjusting an abstract painting that appeared to be slightly out of level, she heard a commotion coming from the gallery's conference room. It wasn't uncommon for last-minute meetings to happen, but the energy felt different. Curious, she got close enough to hear bits of conversation. The name Brandon Hayes echoed repeatedly. That name wasn't strange. He had already been a great promise in the world of fine arts, until he mysteriously disappeared a few years ago. Now the rumor was that he would be the gallery's new director. The shock went through Sarah like an electrical wave. The gallery had given no warning about such drastic changes, and the arrival of a new director, especially one with as controversial a background as Brandon Hayes, was unexpected. Although she tried to ignore the weight of the news, a part of her felt that it could complicate things, especially since she already had her routine perfectly set. And a new director meant changes. Lots of changes. Shortly afterwards, all employees were called for the official presentation of the new director. Sarah positioned herself discreetly at the back of the room, near a wall adorned with a vibrant expressionist piece. As the murmurs died down and eyes turned toward the entrance, when Brandon finally appeared, the atmosphere immediately became more tense. He was tall, with a confident stance that bordered on arrogance. His clear eyes had an analytical, almost cold look, and his expression was that of someone who would rather be feared than admired. He introduced himself with few words, making it clear that his style was direct and focused on results. From today onwards, I want this gallery to be synonymous with innovation, relevance, and impact. I'm not interested in maintaining the status quo, he stated, sweeping his eyes around the room until they briefly landed on Sarah, who reflexively turned away. The look, she couldn't deny that he had a presence, but it was also impossible to ignore the discomfort his attitude caused. The meeting ended quickly, but the impact remained. Sarah returned to her office, a small room filled with art books, sketches, and photographs from past exhibitions. She tried to focus on her reports, but thoughts about Brandon distracted her. She had already read about him in articles years ago, a brilliant artist who reached his peak at a young age, but whose career collapsed after a scandal involving an influential collector. What would he be doing as a gallery director now? And why did he seem so distant and indifferent? The day passed at a leisurely pace, and the tension among employees was palpable. Some wondered whether Brandon would impose drastic changes, while others speculated about the reasons behind his appointment. Sarah, in turn, was more concerned about how this new dynamic could interfere with her secret life. She had planned to post a new review of one of Alex's songs that night, but the mood in the gallery made her uneasy. Later that afternoon, Sarah was called into Brandon's office. The space, which had previously been a common room, now seemed like something else with his presence. The few cardboard boxes he brought were stacked in a corner, but there were no signs of personalization. Everything was impersonal, just like him. Brandon sat at his desk, reviewing papers with a concentration that seemed impenetrable. Sarah Carter, right? He looked up, and his voice was as firm as his posture. She nodded, maintaining her composure. Yes, Mr. Hayes. How can I help? She chose her words carefully, determined not to show her discomfort. I reviewed some old gallery reports. You're responsible for many of the most successful exhibitions of the last 2 years. Impressive. The compliment seemed mechanical, but it was enough to surprise her. Thank you. I work hard to ensure the success of the exhibitions. Good, because I want you to take an even bigger role in organizing the next big exhibition. It will be a mix of contemporary art and pop culture influences, something we haven't fully explored here yet, but which has huge commercial potential. The mention of pop culture made Sarah's heart race. Did he happen to know about her connection to the fan world? Or was it just a coincidence? She tried to hide her nervousness, but something in Brandon's eyes seemed like he was the type to see beyond the surface. Of course, I'll work to make sure the project is a success, she replied, trying to sound confident. Great. I hope you maintain the same level of excellence I saw in your reports. Any slip up, and I will take necessary action. He waved her away, and Sarah left the office feeling a mixture of relief and exasperation. As he walked through the halls of the already empty gallery, his thoughts were a whirlwind. Brandon wasn't just demanding, he was a challenge she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Still, part of her felt intrigued. It wasn't just because of his figure or his mysterious story, but because of the fact that, somehow, he seemed to see her in a way that no one else did. It made her restless. When she got home that night, Sarah put on her favorite Alex Ries's playlist while she opened her laptop. She wanted to disconnect from the chaotic day and immerse herself in something that made her feel alive. But even as she wrote an impassioned post about Alex's latest public appearance, Brandon's cold, analytical gaze continued to haunt her mind. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the gallery earlier than usual. The day before still weighed heavily on her mind, and the conversation with Brandon seemed to echo in her head. He had already made it clear that it would require maximum dedication, and although she was known to be an impeccable professional, the idea of working so closely with someone so intense made her uncomfortable. His morning tranquility was interrupted as soon as he crossed the main corridor and realized that Brandon was already there. Walking through the gallery with his cell phone in his hand and a charged expression, he was accompanied by a woman Sarah recognized as Fiona Lambert, an outside curatorial consultant. Fiona was known for her bold approach and her insistence on modernizing traditional galleries. Brandon seemed engaged in a conversation with her, gesturing to spaces in the walls as they discussed possibilities. Sarah hesitated before approaching, but before she could decide whether to back away or not, Brandon saw her. "Sarah, good morning," he said, his firm voice echoing through the gallery. Fiona turned to face her, appraising her with a clinical gaze that made Sarah feel like a piece of art for sale. "Good morning," she replied with a polite smile, although inside she was tense. "Come here. I want to hear your opinion about something." Brandon gestured for her to join them. Reluctantly, Sarah complied, maintaining her composure. "We are evaluating how to restructure the gallery for the next big event," he explained, indicating one of the main spaces. "I want something that is visually impactful, something that will grab the audience's attention and make them talk about it for weeks." Fiona added, "We're thinking about mixing contemporary art with something more accessible, perhaps an approach that connects pop culture with more traditional forms, something that attracts a younger audience." Sarah nodded slowly, processing the idea. It seemed interesting, but at the same time challenging, especially considering the sophisticated crowd the gallery typically catered to. "It's a bold approach, but it can be effective if we get the balance right," she commented. "The key will be to ensure that the execution does not compromise the artistic integrity of the pieces." Brandon raised an eyebrow, impressed by her response. "Exactly, and that's why I want you directly involved in this project. I need someone who can find that balance." Before Sarah could respond, Fiona smiled enigmatically. "By the way, Brandon mentioned that we are considering bringing in Alex Ries as the face of the exhibit. I think he perfectly represents this convergence between art and pop culture." Sarah's heart stopped for a moment. Alex Ries? She felt the blood rush to her face and tried to hide the panic that was setting in. His fan page was one of the most active about Alex, and working directly with him was a dream and a nightmare. The possibility that someone could connect the dots and discover her secret identity terrified her. Alex Reyes? She repeated, trying to sound casual. This is ambitious. He is a very well-known figure. But does he fit the profile of the gallery? Brandon narrowed his eyes, as if trying to decipher what was behind her tone. He already has experience with artistic projects. We are not choosing a random face. Furthermore, his presence can attract a larger audience and help consolidate this new direction I want for the gallery. Fiona nodded. We are finalizing negotiations, but everything indicates that he is interested. Sarah kept a smile on her face as her mind raced. She would need to act with extreme caution. Any slip-up and his secret identity could be revealed. Plus, working with Alex meant constantly being in his presence, which was intimidating in itself. But worst of all was the fact that Brandon seemed like the type who wouldn't let anything slip. He had already demonstrated an unsettling talent for observing people and understanding their intentions. Throughout the day, Sarah tried to focus on her tasks, but the anxiety was almost unbearable. She avoided running into Brandon as much as possible, but it seemed like he was everywhere at once, reviewing details, discussing plans with the other employees, and making it clear that he wouldn't tolerate anything less than excellence. Later that afternoon, Sarah was called into his office again. She took a deep breath before entering, prepared to face whatever it was. You seem distracted today, he commented as soon as she entered. Sorry, it's just the weight of the project. It's a big challenge. Brandon leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. I know it's challenging, but I chose you to lead because I believe you're up to it. However, I'll be honest, I want you to be 100% focused. I can't allow anything to interfere. She swallowed hard. Understood. He watched her for a moment before continuing. Excellent. Now we need to start organizing the event details. I want a list of artists and space layout ideas on my desk by the end of the week. Sarah nodded and quickly left, feeling as if she had just come from an interrogation. She knew Brandon wasn't kidding. He was meticulous and demanding, and any mistake could be fatal to his career. Later at home, she tried to relax, but the idea of working with Alex Reyes wouldn't leave her head. The connection between her professional life and her fan world had never been so close, and that scared her. At the same time, there was something about Brandon that made her uneasy. He was intense, almost relentless, but there was also a passion in his approach that she couldn't ignore. It was as if he was carrying the weight of something that drove him to be so rigid. While preparing a new post for her fan page, Sarah found herself thinking about what Alex would say about the event. He was known for being laid back and creative, the opposite of Brandon. It was strange to imagine the two of them working together. However, a part of her felt this could be a unique opportunity, both for the gallery and for herself. He just needed to make sure his secret remained intact. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the gallery determined to prove to Brandon that she could handle the project. She began gathering ideas and organizing meetings with other team members, maintaining a facade of confidence as she struggled to balance her anxiety. Brandon watched her from afar, evaluating every move, but he didn't say anything. Over the course of the week, preparations began to take shape, and Sarah found herself more involved than ever. Each decision was analyzed thoroughly, and Brandon did not hesitate to point out flaws or suggest changes. Although this frustrated her, she also realized that he was committed to making the event a success. Little by little, a strange dynamic began to form between them, a mix of mutual respect and constant tension. When the news of Alex Reyes' participation was officially confirmed, the excitement in the gallery reached its peak. Sarah feigned surprise and excitement like everyone else, but inside she was panicking. She knew the real test was just beginning. The atmosphere at the LA Gallery Horizons became a mix of excitement and tension as preparations for the Alex Reyes exhibition progressed. Brandon, as always, demonstrated his usual insistence on perfection, while Sarah did her best to keep her professional facade intact. Internally, she felt like she was on a tightrope, balancing her secret fan life and the increasing pressure of working directly on a project involving her idol. That afternoon, Brandon showed up at Sarah's office unannounced, something that was becoming a habit. He held a folder of documents, but the look he gave her was more analytical than usual, almost as if he were evaluating something beyond the professional. Sarah, I have a few questions about the preliminary information you sent to the marketing team, he said. straight to the point. She tried to appear calm, but the mention of her in the promotional material made her apprehensive. Of course, what do you need to clarify? Brandon sat in the chair across from him, opened his folder, and pulled out a sheet full of notes. You suggested we highlight Alex Reyes' private photography collection, which is an interesting but very specific idea. How exactly did you know he was willing to share this? Until now, not even his publicist had mentioned the collection. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had made the suggestion based on an old interview that Alex had given to a niche magazine. It was something only die-hard fans like her would probably know. Thinking quickly, she forced a confident smile. I read it in an article a few months ago. I thought it might be something unique to highlight the exhibit. I can look up the reference for you if you need it. Brandon continued looking at her for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, he tilted his head slightly, as if testing his answer. Interesting. It's a valid suggestion, but I need you to send me that reference. I'd prefer to confirm the details before we present anything to the public. Sure, no problem. Sarah knew she would need to dig through her arsenal of Alex knowledge to find the specific interview. Increasingly, it seemed that Brandon wasn't the kind of person to let anything slide. He stood up and stood still for a moment, still watching her. You seem to have a notable interest in Alex Reyes. It's rare to find someone so familiar with his work, especially such specific details. Sarah felt her face heat up, but managed to hide it with a small smile. I've been working with art for years. It's natural to follow the main figures in this universe. Brandon just nodded, but the doubt in his eyes remained. When he left the room, Sarah sighed in relief, but she also knew she needed to be more careful. The last thing she wanted was for him to start connecting the dots and discover her life as a fan page administrator. That night, Sarah decided to do something she rarely did. Go to a contemporary art exhibition in the city center in person. The event was being promoted as an immersive, interactive experience, and although it wasn't directly related to the gallery, she knew it would be useful for inspiration. Plus, it would be an opportunity to get away from the constant pressure of working under Brandon's watchful eye. Upon arriving at the venue, a large space lit by neon lights, Sarah quickly lost herself in the atmosphere. The space was filled with creative installations, including video projections, abstract sculptures, and even a virtual reality section. She took some discreet photos with her cell phone for future reference, immersed in the creativity around her. While exploring an installation that mixed music and visual art, she heard a familiar voice behind her. His body tensed immediately. Sarah Carter. What are you doing here? She turned and saw Brandon standing a few feet away, with an expression that mixed surprise and curiosity. He was dressed casually, a rare sight, but his posture remained imposing. Brandon? I didn't expect to find you here. She forced a smile as she tried to control her discomfort. I didn't expect to see you either. I thought you preferred the more traditional hallways of our gallery. The teasing in his voice was subtle but evident. I'm here for inspiration, she replied, trying to sound casual. I thought it would be helpful to explore some ideas for the project. He took a step forward, his gaze fixed on her. Funny, that's exactly what I thought. Although, actually, I'm here for another reason. One of the artists who worked with me in the past is showing a piece here, and I wanted to come check it out. Sarah nodded, trying to keep the conversation brief, but to her surprise, Brandon seemed inclined to prolong it. Have you seen the installation at the top? It's one of the most impressive. He indicated a staircase to the side. No, not yet. I was just heading in that direction. Great. We can go together. The suggestion seemed more like an order than an invitation, and Sarah had no choice but to follow it. As they walked up the stairs, she felt the tension building. Brandon was too perceptive, and she needed to keep her guard up. When they arrived at the facility, it was indeed impressive. A series of mobile sculptures were arranged in a large space, with lights synchronized to a minimalist soundtrack. Brandon approached one of the pieces, studying it carefully. This kind of work is what I want in the gallery, he commented. Something that provokes a visceral reaction in people. Sarah crossed her arms, tilting her head as she observed the installation. It's interesting, but I think it depends on the audience. Not everyone is ready for something so experimental. Brandon smiled sideways, something rare to see. And you are? The question took her by surprise. Me? I'm always open to new ideas, And even, he looked back at her, his face serious again. Because sometimes you seem so comfortable in your comfort zone that I wonder if you're really willing to take a risk. The provocation was clear, but Sarah refused to take the bait. My job is to ensure that the balance is maintained. Taking risks is important, but without losing sight of the essence. Brandon seemed to consider his answer and then gave a slight nod. Good answer. The rest of the night passed in relative calm, but Brandon's presence at her side kept her constantly alert. When they finally said goodbye, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He didn't seem to have made any connection between her presence there and his secret life, but the interaction only reinforced how careful she would need to be. Back at her apartment, she reviewed her notes and photos from the screening, trying to ignore the fact that Brandon continued to occupy a space in her mind that she couldn't control. He was, without a doubt, the biggest challenge of his career, not just because of his demands as a director, but because he seemed determined to understand every detail about her. The morning started differently for Brandon. The usual black coffee on his office desk seemed insipid, unable to bring the clarity he needed that day. He was sitting at his table in the gallery, reviewing the details of the upcoming event, but his thoughts weren't there. An email, received the night before, kept running through his mind. The sender was a name he had sworn he never wanted to hear again: Leonard Krause. Leonard was one of the most influential art collectors in the United States, known for his discerning taste and ability to make or break an artist's career with a single word. To Brandon, Leonard wasn't just a powerful figure. He was the reason Brandon had abandoned his career as a painter. 5 years earlier, Brandon had everything a young artist could dream of: acclaimed exhibitions, invitations to exclusive events, and a promising future. His works, known for their emotional intensity and bold colors, were considered revolutionary. He was the rising name on the art circuit until a single exhibition changed everything. Leonard Krause, attracted by Brandon's growing notoriety, acquired one of his most important pieces, a painting called Fragments. The negotiation seemed like a milestone in Brandon's career, but it soon turned into a nightmare. Leonard began spreading rumors that Brandon used assistants to complete his works, accusing him of being more businessman than artist. The scandal took on gigantic proportions, and despite Brandon denying everything, doubt remained in the air. His credibility plummeted, invitations disappeared, and he watched his career crumble before his eyes. After months of silence and isolation, Brandon decided he would never touch a screen again. He stepped away from the art world, returning to the scene years later, but this time in a different role: gallery director. It was a way to stay close to art without exposing your vulnerabilities again. Now 5 years later, Leonard Krause was back in her life. The email was direct and disturbing. Brandon, I heard about the event you are organizing. I am interested in attending and discussing a possible collaboration. See you soon, Leonard Krause. Brandon read and reread the message, trying to decipher the intentions behind those words. He knew that Leonard did nothing without a calculated purpose. The thought of seeing him again, of having to face him, made her stomach turn. But he also knew that refusing a conversation with Leonard could be interpreted as weakness, something he couldn't afford, especially now when all eyes were on him to ensure the exhibition's success. As she weighed her options, Sarah entered the office, carrying a folder with project updates. She immediately noticed Brandon's tense expression, something unusual even for him. Everything is fine? She asked, cautiously. Brandon looked up, clearly distracted. Yes, why? You seem worried. Sarah hesitated before continuing. If it's something related to the event, maybe I can help. For a moment, he considered telling the truth. It was strange, but there was something about Sarah that made him feel like she would understand. However, Brandon held back. He wasn't ready to share details of his past with anyone, much less someone he barely knew. It's nothing that needs your concern, he replied, his voice firm. But thanks for asking. Any news on the progress of the project? Sarah handed over the folder, sensing the emotional block he had lifted. She knew there was more to this behavior, but decided not to pursue it. Here are the final proposals for the exhibition layout. We made some adjustments based on meetings with the team. Brandon took the folder and opened it, but his eyes skimmed the pages without really seeing them. He knew he needed to focus, but the shadow of Leonard's email seemed to hang over him like a dense cloud. The next day, as Brandon walked through the halls of the gallery, news of an unexpected visitor hit him like a blow. Leonard Krause was there, in the main hall, observing one of the pieces on display with the same imposing posture that Brandon remembered. He wore an impeccable suit, and his presence seemed to attract glances from everyone around him. Brandon felt his heart race, but his exterior remained unshakable. He knew he needed to face Leonard with confidence, even though every instinct in him screamed to avoid him. "Leonard," Brandon greeted him, keeping his tone professional. "What a surprise to see you here." Leonard turned, and a calculated smile appeared on his face. "Brandon Hayes, still as elegant as I remembered. I didn't know it was in town. Business brought me here, and when I heard about your exhibit, I couldn't resist. You always had a special talent for events, even if your artistic side was more complicated." Brandon felt the provocation hidden in Leonard's words, but refused to take the bait. "I'm glad you came. The exhibition will be an important milestone for the gallery." Leonard took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I hope so, because if he isn't, I'm sure many people will be eager to question his ability to run a gallery, just as they questioned his abilities as an artist." The tension in the air was palpable. Brandon knew Leonard was testing him, trying to provoke a reaction, but he maintained his composure. "If you want to discuss any collaboration, we can set up a meeting. My team and I are busy ensuring this event is a success." Leonard gave a low, almost mocking laugh. "Ah, Brandon, still so formal. I hope this event is everything you hope it will be. I will be watching closely." With those words, Leonard walked away, leaving Brandon alone in the room. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to regain control. Seeing Leonard again brought to the surface all the insecurities and wounds he had tried to bury. But it also reignited something he hadn't felt in a long time: anger. A part of him wanted to prove Leonard wrong, that he was more than the scandal that had defined him years ago. As Brandon processed the encounter, Sarah watched him from afar. She had seen the interaction and noticed the change in his posture. Although he had maintained the facade, there was something in his gaze that seemed broken. It was the first time she had seen him so vulnerable, even if it was just for a moment. That night, Brandon came home and stared at a blank canvas that had been stored in his apartment for years. He thought about painting it countless times, but always backed away, afraid of reliving the failure. Now, however, Leonard's presence had rekindled the flame. He held a brush, feeling the familiar weight in his hands, but hesitated. The memories were still too strong. Back at the apartment, Sarah reflected on what she had witnessed in the gallery. Brandon was undoubtedly a difficult person to read, but she was beginning to realize that there was much more to him than the cold, controlling director. Something about his interaction with the mysterious visitor seemed to indicate that he was carrying a heavy burden, something that perhaps explained the intensity with which he worked. As they both wrestled with their own demons that night, the gallery prepared for the next chapter of their lives, a chapter that would, in some way, connect them even more. The days following Brandon's meeting with Leonard Krause were fraught with tension, not just for him, but for the entire gallery team. The Alex Reyes exhibit was shaping up to be the most ambitious event La Horizons had ever organized, and Sarah found herself increasingly bogged down by responsibilities. Despite the chaos, Sarah found small moments of relief on her fan page, posting about Alex, sharing fun facts, and interacting with other admirers provided a sense of control she rarely felt at work. However, the pressure to maintain professionality while dealing directly with the actor she idolized was starting to take a toll on her. She sat in her office, surrounded by art catalogs, and reviewed emails about the pieces that would be displayed alongside Alex's contributions. Even without meaning to, his eyes fell on the messages from his team. Every detail, from choosing the photographs to organizing the opening event, needed his approval. She found herself smiling when she saw Alex's name in each message, but quickly shook her head, trying to concentrate. Brandon, on the other hand, seemed to be everywhere. He monitored every aspect of the exhibit with an intensity that made everyone on the team struggle not to make mistakes. But interestingly, it was Sarah who seemed to carry most of his expectations. That morning, while reviewing Alex's delivery schedules, Sarah heard a knock on the door. He didn't have time to respond before Brandon walked in with the ease of someone who didn't need to ask permission. He was holding a tablet and seemed calmer than usual, but still exuded his usual authority. "Sarah, I need a minute." She looked up from her papers and tried to hide the slight tiredness on her face. "Of course. What can I do for you?" He sat in the chair across from her desk, an action he rarely took. Normally, his interactions were quick and done standing up, as if he didn't have time to settle down. "I have been reviewing the exhibition reports. You have maintained an impressive level of detail in all of your suggestions. To be honest, I didn't expect that." Sarah raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Didn't you expect me to do my job right?" An almost imperceptible smile appeared on Brandon's face. "I meant that you go above and beyond what is expected. It's rare to find someone with that level of commitment." She didn't know how to respond. Brandon rarely gave compliments, and that unexpected comment left her disconcerted. I'm just trying to make sure everything goes smoothly. It's an important event for the gallery. And in person?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze now more intense. "Why are you so invested in this? It seems like this event means more to you than anyone else." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was a simple question, but loaded with implications. Did he suspect something? She remained calm, forcing a smile. "Because it's my job, and I like what I do." Brandon studied her for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "Fair." He seemed satisfied with the answer, but there was something in his expression that indicated he didn't completely believe her. Before she could ask if there was anything else, he changed the subject. "I want you to join me at the meeting with the marketing team this afternoon. We need to line up the last details on promotional materials. Your vision has been essential, and I want to ensure that nothing is left unturned." Sarah nodded, feeling the responsibility weigh even more heavily on her shoulders. The meeting took place in the gallery's main hall, where the marketing team was finalizing the visual concepts. Sarah and Brandon walked in together, and she noticed the curious looks of some of her colleagues. Their presence together seemed to attract attention, but she didn't have time to care. During the discussion, Brandon remained attentive to every detail, but Sarah began to notice something different. Whenever she spoke, he listened more carefully than usual. He asked questions, asked for explanations, and seemed genuinely interested in her ideas. This was new. At the end of the meeting, as everyone gathered their materials, Brandon made a point of mentioning, out loud, Sarah's exceptional work. "Much of what we have achieved so far is the result of her efforts. I hope everyone is on the same level." Sarah felt her face heat up, but managed to thank him with a discreet smile. That public recognition was unexpected and in some ways uncomfortable, not because she didn't deserve it, but because she didn't know what it meant. Was Brandon just being fair, or was there something more behind that gesture? In the following days, the intensity of work only increased. The opening date was approaching, and Sarah was busy with meetings, phone calls, and last-minute adjustments. At home, she barely had time to update her fan page, but she still found a few minutes to post something quick before collapsing into bed. On one of those nights, while reviewing messages from her followers, Sarah noticed a comment that made her freeze. One of the fans mentioned that Alex was posting more about the exhibition, something rare for him. "You're in on this, aren't you, ArtSoul98?" the comment said. Sarah deleted the message immediately, her heart racing. That was exactly what he feared. Despite keeping her identity carefully hidden, there were people in the community who knew she was from Los Angeles and that she worked in art. It wasn't impossible that someone would make the connection, especially now that Alex was so involved in the exhibit. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the gallery even more tense. She needed to keep a cool head and avoid any mistakes that could attract attention. But to her surprise, Brandon seemed different. He was more relaxed, or at least as relaxed as someone like him could be. "Are you ready for today's technical visit?" he asked, crossing his arms as he watched her. "Of course," she replied, not knowing what he was getting at. Excellent. Alex Reyes will be here this afternoon to review the layout of the pieces. I want you to accompany him on the tour. Sarah's world stopped for a moment. Would she work directly with Alex? Being close to him, talking to him, pretending like she wasn't one of his biggest fans? Understood, I said, trying to sound calm. Brandon continued watching her for a moment before smiling slightly. You're prepared for this, right? Sarah lifted her chin, determined. Of course I am. As he left, she took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. From that moment on, he knew he could no longer hide. The day started with a peculiar energy at LA Horizons. There was something in the air that seemed to indicate that things weren't going to go as planned. Sarah arrived early, as usual, but noticed that the atmosphere was busier than usual. Employees ran through the halls, and excited voices echoed in the gallery. She hurried to the main hall, where she found Brandon arguing with two members of the technical team. His posture was firm, but there was a visible tension in his expression. "What is happening?" Sarah asked, approaching. Brandon turned around, his brow furrowed. One of the lighting systems failed. We needed accurate lights to highlight the Alex Reyes pieces and other central works, but apparently some of the equipment was installed incorrectly. Do we have time to sort this out before Alex's visit? Sarah remained calm, even though she knew the problem was more serious than he let on. Not much. He'll be here in less than 2 hours. Brandon ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah began to recognize as a sign of frustration. I've already called the maintenance team, but they said it could take hours. We don't have hours, she thought quickly. Maybe we can temporarily rearrange the pieces so they're in areas with functional lighting. At least that way we can show something while the problem isn't resolved. Brandon hesitated for a moment, weighing the suggestion. Finally, he nodded. It might work. Get some people together and start moving the smaller parts. I'll deal with the technical team to make sure repairs begin immediately. Sarah immediately took charge of mobilizing the team. Within minutes, she was advising employees on which works could be relocated without compromising the integrity of the original layout. Her energy seemed to rub off on others, and even in the midst of chaos, the team began to work in a coordinated manner. Brandon watched from afar, with an expression that mixed relief and admiration. He knew Sarah was good at what she did, but her ability to improvise under pressure impressed him. She had a rare ability to stay calm and find practical solutions, something he didn't see often. However, that wasn't the only thing that intrigued him. There was a lightness to the way she dealt with people, a kind of enthusiasm that seemed to make even the most difficult tasks a little easier for everyone around her. When the clock struck 1 hour before Alex arrived, the gallery was already partially reorganized. It wasn't the perfect scenario, but it was functional, and Sarah felt momentary relief that they had worked around the problem. While checking the final arrangement of the pieces, Brandon approached, crossing his arms. "You did a good job," he said, unceremoniously. "Thank you, but we still need to resolve this before the official event." Sarah looked at him, noticing that, for the first time, he seemed genuinely more relaxed. "And you? Any news from the technical team?" "They said they can fix it in 3 or 4 hours. It doesn't help much now, but at least it's a long-term solution." He gave a soft sigh, something Sarah had never seen him do. "You're good under pressure, you know that?" She laughed softly. "Let's just say I've dealt with some sticky situations, and you don't seem like someone who falls apart easily either." Brandon gave a small smile, a rare and almost imperceptible gesture. "I don't usually, but I confess that today was a test." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Alex Reyes. The actor entered the gallery with his team, his presence immediately lighting up the room. Sarah held her breath for a moment, but remained professional. She walked over to greet him, aware that Brandon was watching her every move. "Mr. Reyes, it's a pleasure to welcome you," she said, with a confident smile. "It's my pleasure, Sarah," Alex responded, his voice warm and his handshake firm. "I'm looking forward to seeing what you've prepared." Brandon also greeted him, maintaining a formal tone, but Sarah noticed that he was studying Alex with the same analytical eye he used to evaluate works of art. It was as if he was trying to understand what made Alex such a magnetic figure. The visit went well, despite the limitations caused by the technical problem. Sarah led Alex through the gallery, explaining the arrangement of the pieces and the intentions behind the layout. Brandon watched silently, occasionally adding comments, but it was clear that Sarah was leading the interaction. To her surprise, Alex seemed genuinely impressed with her knowledge and enthusiasm. "You clearly put a lot of effort into this," Alex commented as he examined one of the pieces. "It's good to see someone who understands both art and the human side behind it." Sarah felt her face heat up, but thanked him with a smile. "It's my job. I want to make sure each exhibition captures the essence of the artist and what they represent." As Alex continued exploring, Brandon approached her. "Were you nervous before he arrived?" "A little," she admitted, "but I think I managed to control myself." "Not only did you control yourself, you turned a potential disaster into something functional." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I have to admit, Sarah, you are more than I expected when I started working here." She raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Is that a compliment?" "It's a fact." He gave a slight smile, a gesture that left her momentarily speechless. When the visit ended and Alex and his team left, the gallery finally began to calm down. Sarah felt the tiredness of the entire day come over her, but also a satisfaction at having managed to deal with the situation. As she was reviewing some papers later that afternoon, Brandon appeared in her office again. "I need you to stay a little longer today," he said, leaning against the door. Sarah looked at him, confused. "Are there any more problems?" "Not exactly, but we still need to review the final timeline for the official opening, and I'd prefer to get that out of the way now while it's still fresh." She sighed but nodded. "All right, give me a few minutes." The two spent the next few hours in Brandon's office, ironing out details and reviewing documents. As time passed, the formality between them seemed to lessen. Brandon was less rigid, and Sarah began to see a side of him she hadn't known. A man who was detail-oriented, but also unexpectedly funny. He made sarcastic comments about some artists and shared stories of absurd situations he faced in other galleries. Sarah laughed more often than she expected and realized something she had never considered before. Behind that stern facade, Brandon was a person deeply passionate about his work. He had a genuine respect for art and the efforts it took to bring it to the public. She began to understand that his rigidity was not just a matter of control, but a way of protecting what he valued. When they finally finished, it was already past 10 at night. Brandon walked her to the gallery door, and as they waited for her taxi to arrive, there was a moment of comfortable silence between them. "Today was a tough day," he said, looking out at the bright Los Angeles skyline, "but you handled it better than most people I know." "It was a team effort," she replied, modestly. "Maybe, but you have something special, Sarah." He looked directly at her, and for a moment, she felt a connection she hadn't expected. The taxi arrived, breaking the moment. Sarah got into the car, still thinking about Brandon's words and his expression. As the vehicle drove away, she realized something had changed. "I didn't know exactly what it was, but Brandon's presence no longer seemed so oppressive. On the contrary, she found herself eager to know more about him." The next morning at LA Horizon started relatively smoothly. Sarah arrived early, carrying her large bag as always, stuffed with papers, notebooks, and unbeknownst to anyone, an autographed poster of Alex Reyes that she had received years ago at an exclusive fan event. It was one of her most precious items, something she kept treasured. But that day it was in her bag by accident. She only realized this when opening her bag in the office to get a document. The poster, rolled up and carefully protected by a clear tube, slipped out as she pulled on the papers. Sarah held her breath, looking at the object with a mix of panic and frustration. "I shouldn't have brought that." She mentally blamed herself, but knew she needed to put it away again before anyone saw it. He got up to lock the door, but before he could take the first step, he heard a firm knock. "Sarah, do you have a moment?" Brandon's voice. Sarah's heart raced, and before she could respond, the door opened. Brandon entered with his usual air of authority, holding a tablet. His gaze immediately fell to the table, where the tube with the poster was in evidence. Sarah felt her face flush as she tried to block Brandon's view, but it was too late. "That's it." He narrowed his eyes, tilting his head slightly as he pointed at the object. Sarah thought quickly, grabbing the tube and holding it to her chest. "Oh, that? It's just a personal thing. Nothing related to work." Brandon raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Something personal? Sounds like something more interesting than a regular document. She forced a laugh, trying to sound carefree. Nothing much, just an old poster I brought to have it framed. I needed to sort it out during lunch, but I forgot. Brandon crossed his arms, never taking his eyes off her. Can I see? The request was direct and unexpected, and Sarah felt a lump in her throat. I don't think it's necessary. It's just an old poster. Nothing you'd find interesting. I decide what I find interesting. He took a step forward, his expression serious. But there was something in his eyes that seemed curious, even provocative. Let me guess. It's related to the Alex Reyes exhibit? The impact of the question almost made her drop the tube. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. Why do you think that? Because you have shown an impressive knowledge of it, as well as an unusual enthusiasm for this exhibition. Brandon didn't look away, and Sarah felt like she was being scrutinized. So I'll ask again. Does this have anything to do with Alex Reyes? She knew she couldn't hesitate. Thinking quickly, she tried to use the same excuse. Well, actually, yes. It's an old poster from one of his movies. I thought it might be interesting to show it to the marketing team, perhaps as inspiration for promotional materials. Brandon narrowed his eyes, weighing each word. He was good at spotting lies, and Sarah knew his nervous tone didn't help. Still, she kept her smile, trying to look casual. Interesting, he said finally, leaning back lightly against the table. Did you bring an old poster of Alex Reyes for inspiration? Yes, it's a unique piece. I thought it could help bring a more authentic vibe to the project. She forced her smile again, but her mind was racing, trying to divert his attention. Brandon seemed to consider it, but didn't insist. He knew there was more to the story, but he decided not to press it at that moment. Well, I hope your inspiration works then. He walked away and placed the tablet on the table. Here are the last details of the schedule. I want you to review and tell me if anything needs to be adjusted before the end of the day. Sarah nodded, grateful that she had escaped, even if it was just barely. As soon as he left the room, she breathed a sigh of relief and put the tube back in her bag, locking it. I couldn't risk something like that happening again. The rest of the day was marked by invisible tension. Brandon seemed more attentive than usual, casting occasional glances at Sarah as if he were trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle. She, on the other hand, did her best to appear indifferent, focusing on her tasks and avoiding any unnecessary interactions with him. That night, while reviewing marketing materials at home, Sarah couldn't help but think about the incident. Brandon was cunning, and she knew she couldn't underestimate him. Although he had escaped this time, his analytical gaze made it clear that he still had doubts. On the other hand, she wondered why it bothered her so much. Brandon wasn't just his boss. He was someone who, unexpectedly, began to occupy a space in your thoughts. The fact that he was so focused on her, even if it was out of suspicion, made her feel something she couldn't explain. The next morning, Brandon looked as focused as ever, but there was a lightness to his posture that Sarah couldn't decipher. As they worked together in a session reviewing the final layout of the exhibition, he made an observation that caught her by surprise. You know, Sarah, it's rare to find someone with as much dedication as you. She looked up, confused. Thanks. I guess it's my job, right? No, it's more than that. He kept his gaze fixed on her, his voice softer than usual. You put passion into what you do. It's different. She felt her face heat up and looked away, focusing on one of the catalogs on the table. Well, I really like what I do. That's obvious, he replied. But there was something in his tone that made her feel like he wanted to say more. As the conversation ended, Sarah realized that despite her suspicions, Brandon seemed to be starting to see her differently. He was still the demanding, controlling boss, but somehow their interactions were changing. Sarah knew she needed to be careful. Her secret was still at stake, but now there was another risk: the growing emotional involvement she was beginning to feel toward Brandon. The gallery was quiet as most of the employees began to leave at the end of the day. The lower lights left the space with an almost intimate feel, where only the sound of Sarah's footsteps echoed through the hallways. She was in the main office, finalizing the final adjustments to the exhibition schedule, when Brandon entered, as always, without knocking. He looked tired, which was unusual, but he still carried the stiff posture she had come to recognize. "Are you still here?" he asked, although the question seemed more like a statement. Sarah, without looking up from the computer screen, replied, "There is still a lot to be resolved. I didn't want to leave anything for tomorrow." Brandon placed some papers on her desk and crossed his arms. "Neither do I, and apparently we have a bigger problem than I thought." Those words captured Sarah's full attention, who looked at him with concern. "What happened?" "One of the main works in the exhibition will not be delivered on time. There was a problem with shipping, and now we need to rearrange the entire layout to accommodate the remaining pieces without it looking like something is missing." Sarah felt a weight in her stomach. The layout had taken weeks to plan and adjust down to the smallest detail. Reorganizing it at that point was a monumental job, especially considering how close they were to opening. "That's complicated," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Complicated, but necessary," Brandon replied, already pulling out one of the chairs to sit next to her. "We need to resolve this now. We can't leave it for later." She looked at the clock. It was after 7 in the evening, and she still hadn't eaten anything since lunch. But I knew Brandon was right. With a resigned sigh, he closed the other files he was reviewing and opened the digital layout of the gallery. "Okay," he said, straightening up in his chair. "Let's get started." For hours, the two worked side by side, discussing ideas, digitally moving the works and adjusting proportions and angles so that the space looked balanced. At the beginning, silence was predominant, interrupted only by technical comments or specific disagreements. But little by little, the environment began to change. Sarah noticed that Brandon was less rigid than usual, making small comments that bordered on humorous, like when he suggested placing one of the more abstract works near the entrance to challenge the audience's patience. She laughed, something he noticed with a slightly amused expression. "You should do this more often," he said, casually. "Do what?" "To laugh. You seem so serious most of the time that it's almost easy to forget you have a sense of humor." She raised an eyebrow, pretending to be offended. "I have a sense of humor. I just don't use it at work." "That explains a lot," he replied, smiling. The conversation flowed more lightly from then on. As they reviewed the positions of the works, Brandon began sharing stories about other exhibitions he had organized, some of them involving absurd situations, like the time an entire installation was dismantled because the artist wanted to change a single detail at the last minute. Sarah listened attentively, fascinated. It was rare for Brandon to talk about his personal experience, and even rarer to see him relaxed enough to share anecdotes. "It looks like you've been through a lot," she commented, not realizing that her tone was almost admiring. "I already passed, and some lessons were really hard," he admitted, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "But I guess that's part of the job, isn't it? Learning to deal with the unexpected." She nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, although sometimes I feel like I'm always waiting for something to go wrong." "You handle it well, anyway." She was surprised by the compliment. "Thanks. And you? How do you deal with all this? Because honestly, I don't know how you manage to stay calm most of the time." Brandon gave a short, humorless laugh. "Who said I keep calm? It's all a facade, Sarah. I get as frustrated as anyone, maybe more." The unexpected vulnerability in his response took Sarah by surprise. She was silent for a moment, trying to process what he had said. It wasn't easy to imagine Brandon Hayes frustrated or insecure, but at the same time, it made sense. No one could carry so much responsibility without feeling the weight of it. "Well, the facade works well," she said, trying to lighten the seriousness of the moment. He looked at her with a half smile, but his eyes still held something deeper, something Sarah couldn't decipher. Around 11 at night, they finally came up with a solution that seemed workable. The revised layout was ready, and they both leaned back in their chairs at the same time, exhausted but satisfied. "We did it," Sarah said, looking at the screen with a mix of relief and pride. "We did it," Brandon repeated, his voice softer than usual. He watched her for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but ended up standing up. "You did a great job." "You too," she replied, standing up as well. They walked together to the exit of the gallery. The silence between them was comfortable, unlike any other moment they had shared before. As Brandon locked the door, Sarah noticed how much less intimidating he seemed that night. He was still the same demanding, perfectionist man, but there was something human about him that she had never noticed before. When they finally said goodbye, Sarah got into her car and sat there for a few minutes before starting the engine. Her thoughts were a mess, but one thing was clear. Something had changed between her and Brandon. Their time together that night revealed sides of both of them that neither of them had shown before. As she drove home, Sarah found herself smiling without realizing it. Brandon Hayes, with all his demands and complexities, wasn't just a difficult boss. He was much more than that. Sarah's anxiety increased by the hour as Alex Reyes' visit approached. It was the first time he would come to the gallery in an official capacity, and she knew it would be a completely different experience from when she accompanied him on the technical visit. At that moment, his role was essentially professional, but the event now had another magnitude. It would be full of guests, journalists, and the ever-observant presence of Brandon, who seemed increasingly attentive to every detail, including hers. That morning, Sarah tried to stay focused as she reviewed her final notes for the event. She was determined to convey the same professional indifference she had displayed before, but she knew it would be challenging. Alex was a captivating presence, and she would need to restrain herself to avoid any display of enthusiasm that might arouse suspicion. When he arrived at the gallery, he saw that the team was already in full motion. Reception tables were being set up, spotlights were being adjusted, and the faint scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Brandon was already there, reviewing a clipboard with lists and schedules. He seemed unshakable, but Sarah knew he was just as focused as she was. "Sarah," he called when he saw her approaching, "I need you to personally handle Alex's initial reception. You know the layout of the exhibit better than anyone, and I want everything to go perfectly." She felt her stomach drop, but nodded. "Of course. I'll make sure everything goes as planned." "Good. Remember, eyes will be on him. Make sure he has everything he needs." Sarah felt the pressure increase, but remained calm. As the minutes passed, the gallery began to fill with guests. Local celebrities, art critics, curators, and journalists circulated through the space, creating a buzz that only increased its tension. Finally, the moment has arrived. Alex Reyes entered the gallery with a small team of advisors, and as always, his presence immediately captured the attention of everyone around him. He looked impeccable in a sharp suit, but his expression was warm and approachable. Sarah walked over to him, aware that Brandon was just a few feet away, watching their every interaction. "Mr. Reyes, welcome back to LA Horizons. It's a pleasure to welcome you." Alex smiled, shaking her hand firmly. "Sarah, please call me Alex. It's good to see you again. I've been thinking a lot about what you showed me last visit. I'm looking forward to seeing how it all turns out." She kept her smile controlled even though her heart was racing. "It turned out even better than we expected. I will personally accompany you to the event." As they walked through the exhibit, Sarah began guiding Alex through the highlights, explaining the choices behind the layout and selected pieces. She managed to maintain her composure, but she felt Brandon's gaze following her every movement, as if he were analyzing something beyond her professional competence. Alex, for his part, seemed genuinely interested in everything Sarah said, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his appreciation for the art. However, in a moment's pause, he leaned slightly towards her and murmured something that made her freeze. "You have a unique way of talking about art, almost as if you were a passionate fan." Sarah felt her face heat up, but managed to respond with a relaxed tone. "I think being passionate about art is part of the job." Alex laughed softly and nodded, but her tension was rising. He couldn't allow him or Brandon to see anything that indicated their true connection to the fan world. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, Brandon remained attentive. He noticed the ease with which Sarah and Alex interacted, something that seemed to go beyond professional formality. Although he couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was, there was something there that bothered him. The event continued at a steady pace, and Sarah began to relax, thinking she could get through the night without any problems. However, as he accompanied Alex to another part of the gallery, a young woman, visibly emotional, approached them. "Sarah?" the young woman said, hesitantly but clearly excited. Sarah turned around, confused, and recognized the face immediately. She was an active follower of his fan page, someone he had already exchanged messages with a few times. Panic began to grow as she tried to hide it. "Hi, sorry, are you?" The young woman smiled, clearly delighted. "I'm Rachel. You probably don't recognize me, but I follow your page about Alex. It's amazing to see you here, especially next to him." Alex, curious, looked from Sarah to the young woman, but remained silent, waiting to see how she would respond. Brandon, however, was at a distance that allowed him to hear everything. He frowned, watching the interaction even more closely. Sarah felt like the ground was opening beneath her feet, but she reacted quickly. There must be some mistake. I think you're confusing it with someone else." Rachel blinked, looking momentarily confused, but then laughed, as if she understood. "Oh, of course. Sorry, I was just so excited to see you here. Well, I hope you enjoy your evening." Sarah nodded, trying to look calm. "Thank you. Have fun too." When the young woman walked away, Sarah avoided looking directly at Alex or Brandon. She felt their stares, but she knew she needed to maintain her composure. "Interesting," Alex said casually, breaking the silence. "Looks like you have admirers here too." Sarah forced a smile but didn't respond. Brandon, who was approaching, said nothing, but the look he gave Sarah was filled with unspoken questions. As the event came to an end, Sarah felt relieved to see Alex and his team say goodbye. However, the relief was short-lived as Brandon called her into his office for a chat before she left. "Sarah," he began, closing the door behind them. "What was that?" "What?" She tried to sound innocent, even though she knew exactly what he was talking about. "That young lady seemed very sure that you were someone special to her, someone connected to Alex Reyes." Sarah chose her words carefully. "She probably mistook me for someone else. Events like that attract all kinds of people, you know." Brandon kept his gaze fixed on her, clearly unconvinced. "You seem to have an impressive ability to evade direct questions, Sarah." "It's part of my job," she replied, trying to keep her tone light. He was silent for a few moments before finally shaking his head. "Okay, but know that I'm paying attention." Sarah left the office feeling exhausted, but relieved to have avoided yet another dangerous situation. However, she knew it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep her secret. And even worse, she didn't know how to deal with the conflicting feelings that were beginning to grow towards Brandon. The morning after the event, Sarah arrived at the gallery still trying to regain control of her emotions. Meeting Rachel had been an alarming reminder of how vulnerable his secret was. Even with her efforts to throw Brandon off, she knew he wasn't easy to fool. The intensity in his gaze late last night was still fresh in her mind, like a silent threat. As he adjusted the day's schedule at his desk, the familiar sound of firm footsteps announced Brandon's arrival. She barely had time to look up before he walked in with his typical confidence. However, there was something different about him, an almost sarcastic calm. "Good morning, Sarah. Did you sleep well?" he asked with a casual tone that seemed to carry something more. "Sleeping wasn't high on my priority list after yesterday," she replied, keeping it formal. "I understand. Large events tend to consume a lot of energy." He placed a tablet on her desk. "But I'm sure you'll like this." Sarah looked at the tablet suspiciously before unlocking it. On the screen, there was an Instagram page, open to a profile she knew very well, hers, or rather, that of ArtSoul98, the fan page he managed in secret. The air seemed to leave the room as Sarah stared at the device. She felt her heart race, but she forced herself to appear calm. "Where did you find this?" Brandon sat back in the chair across from her, crossing his arms. "Let's just say that yesterday's event was revealing. When that girl mentioned something about you being special to Alex Reyes fans, my curiosity was piqued. A quick search and some obvious connections led to this." She tried to maintain her posture, but she knew the battle was lost. "And what exactly do you think you discovered?" "I think I discovered that my most effective curator is also one of Alex Reyes' biggest fans." He smiled, but there was no kindness in his expression. "It was a smile of someone who was amused by the situation, and that you have kept it very well hidden." Sarah felt her face heat up. "It doesn't interfere with my work, Brandon. I know how to separate things." No doubt. You know, I'm not questioning your competence." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on her. "But it's curious. How exactly are you involved in this world? Because from what I've seen, Your dedication to the page goes far beyond just being a casual fan." She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "Yes, I manage the page. Yes, I'm a longtime fan of his work, but that never influenced my performance here. If that's what you're worried about, I can assure you everything remains professional." "I'm not worried," he replied, his voice firm but still carrying a teasing tone. "Actually, I'm fascinated. You've managed to keep it a secret all this time, and yet you've been the most important piece in organizing his exhibition." She looked at him, trying to decipher his intentions. "So what's the matter, Brandon? Do you want to punish me for this? Or do you want to use this against me?" "Punish you? Of course." He stood up, walking through her office with the calm of a predator who knew he had his prey cornered. "But I think it opens up some interesting possibilities. For example, who better to make sure everything about Alex is perfect than his biggest informal expert?" Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. "That seems more like a trap than a compliment." "Depends on how you look at it," he replied. Looking back at her, "Consider this an opportunity. I will need you to be even more involved in the next phase of the exhibition. And maybe I'll ask your opinion on certain personal details that only someone like you would know." She narrowed her eyes. "You're having fun with this, aren't you?" He gave a slight smile, leaning against her desk. "A little. It's always interesting to see a different side of someone, especially when it's such an unexpected side." In the following days, Brandon's teasing became constant. He asked deliberate questions during meetings, directing them at Sarah in ways that only she understood the double meaning. "Sarah, do you think this arrangement reflects the spirit of Alex's pieces? You must definitely have a unique insight into this." She knew he was testing her limits, but she refused to give in. Each comment was met with a tight smile and a professional response, even if inside, she felt like screaming. On another occasion, he showed up in her office with a stack of promotional photos. "I'm trying to decide which of these best represents Alex's essence. You probably have a well-educated opinion, considering your familiarity with his work." Sarah held the photos, hiding her nervousness. "They are all good options, but I would say this one better highlights his duality as an actor and musician." Brandon nodded slowly, but she knew he was more interested in her reaction than the answer itself. Despite the constant teasing, Sarah began to notice something else in her dynamic with Brandon. There was a genuine curiosity behind the jokes. He wasn't just trying to expose her, but he seemed interested in understanding how someone like her, organized, dedicated and serious, could have such a passionate and almost impulsive side. As annoying as it was, Sarah also found herself thinking about him more than she wanted to. Brandon had become a complex figure in her life. While he pushed and challenged her, he also made her feel something she couldn't name. One night, while organizing the final details of a report, Sarah noticed Brandon standing in the doorway of her office, watching her. "Do you need anything?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to say that despite everything, I'm impressed." She stopped typing and looked at him. "Impressed by what?" "With the fact that you managed to balance two completely different lives and still excel at both." He shrugged, as if it were something simple. "It's admirable." Sarah was speechless for a moment. It wasn't the kind of comment I expected from him. "Thanks, I guess." He smiled almost sincerely before leaving her alone with her thoughts. As she walked home that night, Sarah felt something changing. The secret she so feared revealing no longer seemed to be her biggest concern. It was what that secret was starting to awaken in Brandon and in herself that really scared her. The atmosphere in the gallery seemed to have changed since the event with Alex Reyes. Sarah, although still determined to maintain her composure, felt the weight of Brandon's taunts piling up. He seemed to have turned his secret life into something of a pastime, testing her limits and watching her reactions with a mix of fascination and amusement. However, something in his approach began to change, almost imperceptibly, as if there was something more behind the provocative behavior. That morning, Sarah arrived at the gallery ready to face another day of work. He was reviewing the planning for an upcoming side event when he noticed an unusual murmur among some colleagues. Furtive glances and whispers escaped his direction, creating growing tension. Initially, she ignored it, assuming it was just paranoia. But when she passed by the break room to get a coffee, she heard fragments of a conversation that made her stop in the middle of the hallway. Did you see? That fan page. Sarah looks a lot like the admin. It can't be a coincidence. She was so comfortable with Alex Reyes. And the way he treated her, Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The rumor she feared most seemed to be spreading, and fast. Taking a deep breath, she tried to calm herself before entering the room, where two fellow healers quickly changed the subject upon seeing her. "Good morning," Sarah said, forcing a smile as she picked up her coffee. The two mumbled hurried responses before leaving the room, leaving her alone. As soon as the door closed, she felt tension take over. It wasn't just discomfort, it was fear. If the rumors were to intensify, they could jeopardize not only his reputation, but also his position within the gallery. Before he could collect his thoughts, Brandon appeared in the doorway. He seemed calm, but there was something about his posture that indicated he was aware of what was happening. "Are you well?" he asked, direct as always. Sarah hesitated, but she knew it would be impossible to hide anything from him. "Why do you ask?" "Because half the team is whispering about you." He crossed his arms, his gaze appraising. "And before you try to deny it, yes, I know exactly what they're talking about." She set the coffee cup down on the counter, exasperated. "Excellent. This is exactly what I needed. More people speculating about my personal life." Brandon stepped forward, his voice lower and more serious. "Do you have any plans for dealing with this?" "My plan is to keep working and hope this goes away." He narrowed his eyes, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. "It won't go away, Sarah. Not as long as people think they have something interesting to discuss. You need to face it." She shook her head, feeling the weight of her frustration. "And what do you suggest I do, Brandon? Admit everything and become the main topic of the gallery?" He studied her for a moment before responding. "I suggest you trust me." Her words caught in her throat. Brandon had never suggested anything remotely close to trust before. Their interactions had always been marked by tension, teasing, and challenges. And now he was asking her to trust him. "And why would I do that?" she asked, skeptical. "Because contrary to what you might think, I don't want this to destroy you. I admire what you do here. And besides," he paused, his voice lower, "I know what it's like to have your reputation tarnished by something beyond your control." The comment took her by surprise. He was talking about his own experience, the scandal that drove him away from the art world. She saw a flash of vulnerability in his eyes and, for a moment, realized that he understood what she was going through better than anyone. Before she could respond, the door opened, and one of the senior curators walked in with a suspicious expression. "Sorry to interrupt, but we were wondering about the updated schedule for the next event." Brandon looked at the man with calculated calm. "Sarah is taking care of it. Any problems with the tempo?" The healer hesitated, but Sarah could tell he was trying to measure how far he could go. "Not exactly. There was only a few comments among the team about priorities and focus." "Comments?" Brandon repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, comments about certain personal distractions that may be interfering." Sarah felt her face flush with indignation, but before she could respond, Brandon intervened. "Let me make one thing clear." He took a step forward, stance firm. "Sarah Carter is the most dedicated professional we have here. If anyone has doubts about this, I suggest they review their priorities, because if these distractions are someone's problem, they certainly aren't theirs." The healer stuttered something inaudible before quickly leaving the room, leaving Sarah and Brandon alone again. She looked at him, still processing what had just happened. "Why did you do that?" Brandon shrugged, but his tone was sincere. "Because you deserve more respect than you are getting. And because I know you're better than all of them combined." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and Sarah realized that, for the first time, Brandon was showing a genuinely protective side. He was no longer teasing or testing her limits. He was, in fact, next to her. In the following days, Brandon's attitude towards Sarah seemed to affect others. The rumors began to fade, replaced by a renewed focus on work. More than that, Sarah felt her confidence grow, knowing that even with all the differences between them, Brandon was someone she could trust. Still, she knew the hardest time was yet to come. Her secret remained a threat, but for the first time, she felt like she didn't have to face it alone. The afternoon was golden, with sunlight filtering through the gallery's large windows. creating a play of shadows that danced between the art pieces. The smell of fresh flowers arranged in discreet vases mixed with the light aroma of coffee coming from the break room. It was a contrast to the tension Sarah felt as she headed to Brandon's office, carrying a folder of reports. Her footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, each one reinforcing the nervousness that was growing in her chest. Since confronting the rumors, Brandon had adopted a strangely protective stance, something she didn't know how to process. He was still the same provocative man, but now there was a subtle softness, as if he was trying to balance his role as boss with something more personal. She knocked on the open door, watching him leaning over the table. Brandon was analyzing some documents, his eyes fixed, his hand holding a pen as if he was about to make a note. The sunlight streaming in through the side window outlined his figure, and for a moment, Sarah noticed details she had never noticed before. The strong line of his jaw, the rolled-up sleeves that revealed tense but relaxed forearms. "Do you need something?" he asked without looking up, but his tone was less cutting than usual. "I brought the final reports from Alex's exhibition. I think it would be good to review it together before sending it for approval." He gestured for her to come in, and Sarah took the chair in front of the table. As he handed in the papers, he smelled a faint scent of cedar in the room, something that seemed to come from him. It was unexpectedly pleasant, blending in with the warm afternoon air. Brandon took the reports and began to read them in silence, while Sarah tried to occupy her mind by observing the details of the office. A plant in the corner, books organized on an impeccable shelf, a white screen leaning against the wall, half hidden behind boxes. That last sight aroused his curiosity. "Do you paint?" The question escaped him before he could stop himself. He looked up, looking surprised for a moment, before following her gaze to the screen. "No more." There was something final in his answer, something Sarah felt she shouldn't question. But at the same time, the intensity in his voice suggested a story he kept under lock and key. "It is a shame. Art has so much power. It would be a waste not to use it." Brandon closed the report, setting it aside as he stared at her. For a moment, she thought he would scold her, but instead he relaxed against the chair, his eyes fixed on her. "Do you really believe that?" "Of course I believe it. I don't think someone with his passion for what he does could just ignore that." He laughed, but it was a short, bitter sound. "Passion, huh? It's funny to hear that from you, especially considering that my last attempt to put passion into my art ended up being the undoing of my career." Sarah leaned forward slightly, intrigued, and at the same time, wary. Brandon rarely talked about himself, and that glimpse of vulnerability felt precious. "What happened, Brandon?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair as he looked out the window. The golden light now reflected in his eyes, which seemed clearer, almost transparent. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, carrying a sincerity that Sarah had never heard before. "My last exhibition as an artist was a disaster, not because of the works themselves. They were good, I know that. But I made the wrong choice to trust the wrong person." She didn't interrupt him, letting the silence encourage him to continue. "Leonard Krause," he continued, the name coming out of his mouth like something bitter. "He was the most influential collector I have ever met. When he became interested in my work, I thought my career was made. I sold him a piece, one of the best I've ever painted. But soon after, he started spreading rumors that I didn't do my own work. He said I used assistants, that my pieces were more marketing than art." Sarah held her breath. I had heard snippets of this story before, but hearing it directly from Brandon was completely different. It was a calculated blow. Not only did he undermine my credibility, he ensured that no one trusted me anymore. Within weeks, invitations to exhibitions disappeared. Buyers disappeared, and I lost everything. There was a sadness in his words that Sarah felt deeply. He wasn't just telling a story. He was reliving every painful moment. "Why would he do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon shrugged, but his gaze was blank. "Because he could. Because, in the art world, reputation is everything. And once it is tarnished, it is almost impossible to recover." Sarah felt a wave of indignation rise in her chest. "That's cruel. You didn't deserve this." "Maybe not, but I learned an important lesson. Trusting people too much only leaves you vulnerable." He laughed humorlessly. "That's why I'd rather be on the other side right now. Running a gallery is more safer, "But it's not what you love," Sarah said, before she could stop herself. Brandon looked at her, surprised by her boldness. For a moment, he seemed about to say something sharp, but he decided against it. Instead, he sighed. "No, it is not." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Sarah felt like he had left a part of himself exposed, something he probably didn't do often, or ever. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said, softly. He gave a slight nod, but there was something in his gaze that seemed more open. The following days were marked by a new dynamic between the two. Brandon was still demanding and direct, but there was a lightness to their interactions that hadn't been there before. Sarah felt like she had somehow gotten closer to him, as if that exchange had created a bridge that they both feared but also wanted to cross. On the other hand, Sarah herself began to notice something different about herself. She found herself thinking about Brandon more than she should have, about how he looked at her with that mix of challenge and curiosity, how his voice sounded softer when they were alone. One day, while working together on a project, their eyes met for a moment longer than usual. There was something there, something unsaid but impossible to ignore. They both looked away at the same time, but the heat of that moment remained. Sarah knew there was something growing between them, something neither of them seemed willing to admit. But for the first time, she wasn't sure if this was something she should fear or embrace. The weather in Los Angeles felt muggier than usual, and the warm sunlight reflected off the tall buildings almost blindingly. In the gallery, the air conditioning struggled to keep the atmosphere pleasant as the team dealt with final preparations for the next event. Sarah was in her office, surrounded by stacks of documents and charts, but her mind was far from there. Since her conversation with Brandon, she hadn't been able to stop thinking about him, about the pain he had silently carried and the impact that collector, Leonard Krause, had had on her life. She didn't know exactly why she cared so much. Maybe it was the unfairness of it all, or maybe it was Brandon's restrained expression as he told his story, as if every word was a battle. Either way, she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something, even if she had no idea what. It was while reviewing one of the financial reports from the Alex Reyes exhibition that something caught his attention. A name appeared on one of the lists of sponsors associated with the event: Leonard Krause. The paper slipped from her hands, and Sarah felt her stomach drop. That man, the same figure who had destroyed Brandon's career, was now linked to the gallery's most important event. Her first instinct was to confront Brandon immediately, but she hesitated. He had been so clear about his distrust of Krause, about avoiding all mention of him, that Sarah knew it would shake him. And maybe if she could find out more, she could protect him without reliving his trauma. Making an impulsive decision, she started looking for information about Leonard. The internet was a bottomless pit of information, and Sarah quickly realized he had his hands in countless artistic projects. His name was linked to several galleries, emerging artists, and major cultural events, always surrounded by an aura of prestige. But as she looked deeper, Sarah found something that made her catch her breath. Leonard was also a major investor in one of the agencies representing Alex Reyes. It was a tenuous connection, but suspicious enough. Leonard seemed to have a history of reaching out to rising talent, using his influence to shape their careers. But what could he want with Alex? And more importantly, why would he be interested in getting involved with the exhibition? Sarah's mind was racing as she gathered every piece of information she could find. He spent hours researching, almost without noticing the passage of time, until the sky outside began to darken. When he finally sat back in his chair, he felt a mixture of adrenaline and exhaustion. She needed to confront someone with what she had discovered, but who could she turn to? The next day, Sarah arrived at the gallery earlier than usual. The morning light was still dim, dyeing the interior of the gallery in soft tones of gold and gray. She hoped to find a moment of peace to collect her thoughts, but to her surprise, Brandon was already there. He was standing in the main hall, hands in his pockets, looking at one of the exhibits. She hesitated before approaching, but upon hearing the sound of his footsteps, he turned, his eyes meeting hers. "You're here early," he said, no surprise in his voice. "And you too." He gave a slight smile, but there was something distant in his expression. "Some nights are harder than others. I thought working would distract me." Sarah swallowed hard, feeling a pang of guilt. She knew that what she was about to say could make him even more uneasy, but she couldn't keep that information in mind. "Brandon, I need to talk to you about something." He raised an eyebrow, indicating for her to continue. "It's about Leonard Krause." Upon hearing the name, Brandon visibly tensed. He crossed his arms as if preparing for battle. "What about him?" Sarah hesitated, but gathered her courage. "I was reviewing the sponsors for Alex's exhibit, and Leonard is involved. He's one of the main investors." The silence that followed was almost palpable. Brandon looked away, jaw clenched. Finally he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Of course he is. I also discovered something else," Sarah continued, realizing she couldn't stop there. "He has a connection with the agency that represents Alex. I don't know exactly what that means, but I don't think it's a coincidence." Brandon let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "Leonard doesn't do anything without a reason. If he's involved with Alex, it's because there's something for him to gain. Then we need to find out what it is," Sarah said, the determination in her voice surprising even herself. Brandon shook his head, looking torn between wanting to protect her and not wanting to revisit his past. "Sarah, this is not something you should get involved with. Leonard is dangerous. He destroys people, and you think I'm just going to stand by while he does it again?" "Brandon, I can't ignore this." His eyes met hers again, and for a moment, Sarah saw something deeper, a mixture of concern and something that seemed like admiration. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" he asked, his tone almost resigned. "No." He sighed again but nodded. "All good, but if we're going to do this, let's do it right. No acting impulsively." The days that followed were a mix of tension and strategy. Sarah and Brandon began working together in secret, analyzing Leonard's every move and its connection to the exhibit. Brandon was reluctant to delve too deeply, but Sarah's insistence seemed to convince him that it was the only way. Finally, they managed to discover something that could be the missing piece. Leonard appeared to be manipulating the exhibition to guarantee exclusive access to one of the gallery's most valuable pieces, a rare work that he had been trying to acquire for years. He used his influence to mask his true intentions, and Alex Reyes, with his notoriety, was just a pawn in the game to attract attention and cover up his actions. Confronting him would be risky, but Sarah knew there was no other choice. The night before the big event, while the gallery was empty, she and Brandon discussed the plan amid the low sound of fans and the faint smell of polished wood. "Are you sure about this?" Brandon asked, his voice thick with concern. "I am." He looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "All good, but I will be by your side all the time." His promise brought Sarah a strange relief. She knew she was taking a risk, but with Brandon by her side, she felt like she could face anything. The next event would be decisive, and they both knew that nothing would be the same after that. The night before the big event was full of expectation. The air inside the gallery was thick with the smell of polished wood, mixed with the light floral scent of arrangements carefully placed throughout the hallways. The soft lighting made the artworks appear to float in their frames, as if the space itself was holding its breath. It was the first time in years that Brandon felt anything close to hope, a real possibility that perhaps his reputation could be restored. Sarah, for her part, was immersed in the final adjustments, moving with an almost fierce determination. Dressed in a cream-colored silk shirt and elegant black pants, she looked like she belonged in the gallery's sophisticated surroundings, but her eyes sparkled with an energy that contrasted with the formality of the place. Brandon watched her from afar, leaning against one of the columns, his hands in his pockets. He was still trying to understand how Sarah had become so important to him, not just in a professional sense, but in a way he couldn't explain. She wasn't like other people he knew in the art world. His passion was less about technique and more about connection. It was an almost naive vision, but it made him question everything he had learned about this universe. As she approached with a clipboard full of notes, the sound of her heels echoed through the empty room, but it failed to cover the light citrus scent of her perfume. Brandon felt an involuntary smile appear on his lips before he composed himself. "We need to review the schedule once again," she said bluntly. He raised an eyebrow. "Again? We've been through this at least 3 times today, and we will pass 3 more if necessary." Her tone was firm, but there was a spark of humor in her eyes that he couldn't help but notice. "All good. Let's go." They sat at one of the nearby tables, surrounded by papers, mock-ups of the exhibition layout, and a laptop that displayed the guest list. Sarah was talking about the strategic placement of a centerpiece when Brandon interrupted, pointing to one of the pages. "Did you do this?" he asked, referring to a simple but incredibly detailed sketch of the arrangement of the pieces. She looked at him, surprised. "Yes, it's just a draft. I needed to better visualize how the works would connect." Brandon ran his finger across the paper, as if absorbing the dedication behind each stroke. "That's impressive. It's not something most people would do." "Well, I think art deserves it," she replied, shrugging. He watched her for a moment longer than he intended. "You really love this, don't you?" "Of course I love it." She placed her clipboard on the table and crossed her arms. "Art has the power to make us feel things we didn't even know were there. It connects people, challenges us, gives us hope. How can you not love something like this?" Her words echoed in the silence that followed, and Brandon felt something tighten in his chest. There was so much fervor in her voice, so much sincerity, that he realized how much he had lost that kind of passion. "You have a unique vision," he said finally. "I don't know how you can keep it up in such a cynical world." "Maybe it's because I don't care what the world thinks," she replied with a slight smile. "The important thing is how art makes me feel, and that's what I want to share with others." Brandon looked away, but couldn't stop the smile that appeared on his lips. "You are a fascinating person, Sarah Carter." She laughed softly. "That sounds more like a compliment that I'm used to hearing from you." "Maybe it is." The two continued working late into the night, reviewing every detail with almost obsessive precision. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the space, while the distant sound of Los Angeles traffic created a constant backdrop. With each interaction, Sarah and Brandon became more in sync, almost as if they shared their own language. When they finally finished, the clock was almost midnight. The main hall was ready, shining in the soft light of the spotlights. Brandon looked around, feeling a rare sense of satisfaction. "We did it," he said, crossing his arms as he admired their work. "We did it," Sarah repeated. But there was something in her tone that caught his attention. He looked at her and saw the weariness in her eyes, but also something else: pride, accomplishment, maybe even happiness. It was as if that moment was as important to her as it was to him, and Brandon felt an inexplicable warmth rise in his chest. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, breaking the silence. She frowned, confused. "For what?" "For reminding me what it means to truly care." Her eyes met his, and for an instant, the world around her disappeared. There was something profound about that exchange, something neither of them were ready to admit, but something that was impossible to ignore. "You're welcome," she replied, almost in a whisper. That night, as they each walked home, their thoughts were filled with each other. Sarah knew something had changed, but she wasn't sure what that meant. Brandon, for his part, felt like he had rediscovered something he thought he had lost forever: the ability to connect, to truly feel. When the grand event finally began, the gallery was filled with guests, lights, colors, and the soft hum of lively conversation. Sarah and Brandon moved through the space as partners in perfect harmony, their presences complementing each other. And although neither of them said it out loud, they both knew that this event wasn't just about saving the gallery or rebuilding Brandon's career. It was about something much bigger, something that, for the first time in years, seemed possible again. The night of the big event arrived, and LA Horizons was more vibrant than ever. The gallery's facade glowed under impeccable architectural lighting, with spotlights casting subtle lights in shades of gold and blue that highlighted the entrance. The scent of fresh flowers wafted through the air, mixing with the sophisticated scent of guests arriving in elegant cars. The muffled sound of conversations and laughter echoed through the space as the flow of people grew, creating an electric energy that seemed to pulse between the walls. Sarah was standing near the entrance, wearing a long black dress with delicate lace detailing on the shoulders. Her hair was tied up in a simple but elegant way, and light makeup highlighted her bright eyes. She mentally reviewed every detail of the event as she greeted guests, her warm smile contrasting with the nervousness she felt inside. Brandon, on the other hand, was in his comfort zone, wearing a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, He looked like an impeccable authority figure. However, his eyes were always attentive, sweeping the room and observing every movement, every detail. As if he was ready to solve any problem that arose, the two had worked together tirelessly over the previous few days to ensure everything was perfect. Sarah had taken the lead on many creative decisions, and Brandon, to her surprise, let her take the reins on more occasions than she expected. Now watching it all unfold, he couldn't help but feel a silent pride as he watched her navigate the room with ease and grace. As the event officially began, Sarah and Brandon strategically positioned themselves in the main hall, where the centerpiece of the exhibit was on display. The work was an interactive installation that combined visual projections and sound, projecting a powerful narrative about identity and transformation. The guests approached with expressions of curiosity, and the low conversation soon gave way to exclamations of admiration. "It worked," Sarah said, almost in a whisper, as she stood next to Brandon. He looked at her, noticing the sparkle in her eyes. "It worked because you believed in it. More than anyone." She smiled, a real smile that made him feel something he couldn't explain. For a moment, everything around them disappeared. The guests, the background music, even the play shining in shades of blue and silver. It was as if they were the only two in that space, connected by something that grew between them with each shared moment. However, the calm was interrupted when a particular guest entered the hall. Leonard Krause. Sarah saw the immediate change in Brandon's posture. He straightened up, shoulders tense, lips pressing into a thin line. It was as if every muscle in his body was prepared for a confrontation. Leonard, on the other hand, looked completely at ease, with an impeccable suit and a smile that exuded confidence. "Brandon, my dear, what a pleasure to see you again," Leonard said, approaching with the gentleness of a predator who knew he was at the top of the food chain. Brandon didn't respond immediately, but his steady gaze spoke more than any words. Sarah, sensing the rising tension, stepped forward, holding out her hand with a controlled smile. "Mr. Krause, welcome. It's an honor to have you with us tonight." Leonard took her hand and held it a little longer than necessary. "Sarah Carter, the mastermind behind it all. I've heard a lot about you." Sarah kept her smile, but there was something about his tone that made her feel uncomfortable, like she was being evaluated in a way that had nothing to do with her job. "I hope the exhibition lives up to expectations," she said, stepping back slightly. "Oh, no doubt. I look forward to exploring every detail." Leonard took one last look at Brandon before walking away to inspect the central facility. When he walked away, Sarah turned to Brandon, who was still stiff. "Are you well?" "I am, but he shouldn't be here. I know. And that's why we need to stay focused. If he's trying something, we can't let him know we're aware." Brandon took a deep breath, nodding. "You're right. Let's keep this professional." Despite his words, it was clear that Leonard's presence had shaken Brandon more than he wanted to admit. Sarah, however, felt a growing determination. This event was more than a chance to rebuild the gallery or Brandon's career. It was an opportunity to show Leonard that he didn't have the control he thought he did. As the night progressed, the two remained attentive, sharing the work of interacting with guests and ensuring everything ran smoothly. At one point, as Sarah explained the concept behind the exhibit to a group of journalists, Brandon watched from afar. There was something magnetic about her, the passion with which she spoke, the way her eyes lit up when she discussed art. He had never met anyone like Sarah. At first he thought his emotional approach to art was almost childish, but now he saw it was something much deeper. It was the kind of passion he had lost years ago. And seeing her like this made him feel a pang of desire, not just for her, but for what she represented. The event that Sarah and Brandon had so dedicatedly planned had finally come to an end. The soft lights in the gallery were beginning to dim, leaving a golden glow over the artworks and casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. The smell of wine and flowers still hung in the air, an echo of the laughter and conversation that had filled the space a few hours before. Now, there were just the two of them left. Sarah was in the main hall, observing the illuminated pieces, her arms crossed over her chest in an unconscious gesture of tiredness. She knew the event had been a success, but the weight of the last few days seemed to finally catch up with her. Every choice, every detail, Every decision had been made with an intensity that she didn't know she was capable of maintaining for so long. Brandon entered quietly, the sound of his footsteps on the floor echoing faintly through the empty space. He stopped a few feet away from Sarah, watching her for a moment. The way she looked at the installation, as if taking in the essence of what they had created, struck him in an unexpected way. He knew he would never have done it alone. And more than that, he knew that Sarah had been the force that made him believe again. "You should be celebrating, not here alone," he said, his voice low and soft. Sarah turned to him, a tired smile appearing on her lips. "I needed a moment to breathe. It all happened so fast. I guess I'm still processing it." Brandon walked over, his hands in his pockets as he stood next to her. "I understand. Sometimes it's hard to take it all in after it's over." She looked at him for a moment, noticing the tiredness on his face. But there was something else there, a softness in his eyes, a warmth she wasn't used to seeing. "You made this happen, Sarah," he said, breaking the silence. She laughed, shaking her head. "We made it happen. It was a joint effort." "No," he insisted, his voice firm but without losing its tenderness. You put your soul into it. The way you look at art, the way you talk about it. It's something I haven't seen in a long time. And it's something I didn't know I needed until I met you." His words hung in the air, creating a dense silence between them. Sarah felt her heart race, but she couldn't look away. There was something about the way he spoke that seemed so sincere, so naked, that it left her speechless. "Brandon," she started, but he interrupted her. "I'm not finished," he said, taking a step forward, now closer to her. "I know about your secret. I know about the fan page, about how much you admire Alex Reyes. And I need you to know that it's okay." Sarah blinked in surprise. She had expected judgment, maybe even sarcasm, but not this. "This?" He smiled lightly, a real smile that completely disarmed her. "Yes, because this is part of who you are. That passion, that dedication, it's what makes you who you are. And honestly, I admire that." His words took her by surprise. She felt a wave of relief mixed with something deeper, something warm and soft that made her chest hurt in a good way. "Do you really think so?" "I think." He took another step forward, and now they were so close that she could feel his warmth, the woodsy scent that seemed to follow Brandon wherever he went. "And I also think I was wrong about you in the beginning. I thought you were frivolous, but in truth, you are the most genuine person I have ever met." Sarah laughed softly, more to herself than to him. "I don't know what to say." "No need to say anything," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence enveloped them again. But this time there was something different, a palpable tension that seemed to fill the space between them. Brandon raised his hand, hesitating for a moment before lightly touching her face. His hand was warm against her skin, and the touch made her breath catch. "Sarah," he started, but stopped, as if he was fighting something inside himself. She didn't know what to say, what to do. All he knew was that his heart was beating too fast, and that the world around him seemed to have disappeared. "Why do you do this to me?" he asked finally, his voice filled with a vulnerability she had never heard before. She replied, her voice shaking slightly. "Yes, you." He smiled sideways, but there was something sad about that smile. "You make me want to try again, feel again, and that scares me." She felt a lump in her throat, but managed to smile, even if it was a small smile. Maybe that's not a bad thing. For a moment he said nothing, just looked at her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her. And then, before she could react, he leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if he was afraid of crossing a line. But when Sarah responded, her arms wrapping around him lightly, something changed. The kiss deepened, becoming more intense, more urgent, as if they were both trying to say everything they couldn't with words. When they finally pulled away, they were both out of breath, but neither of them seemed willing to move. Brandon rested his forehead against hers, his eyes still closed. "Sorry," he said, but there was no regret in his voice. "Don't be sorry," Sarah replied, smiling as she looked at him. He opened his eyes, and what she saw there took her breath away again. It was something raw, something she wasn't sure he'd ever shown anyone before. "I don't know what that means," he admitted, his voice low. "Neither do I," she replied. her own voice shaking. "But maybe we don't need to find out now." He nodded, still holding her, as if afraid to let her go. And for the first time in years, Brandon felt something close to peace. The gallery was now completely empty. The sound of Brandon and Sarah's shoes was drowned out by the soft echo of the silent room. A stark contrast to the hustle and bustle that had filled the space hours before. The dimmed lights created a golden gloom, casting shadows that danced across the walls and carefully placed artwork. The smell of flowers and polished wood still lingered, mixed with the faint scent of Sarah's perfume, which Brandon noticed unintentionally as she took a few steps away, trying to catch her breath after that unexpected kiss. But the distance was short-lived. Sarah stopped, looking at him with wide eyes, a mixture of confusion and excitement vibrating in her expression. She didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to process what had just happened. His heart was still hammering in his chest, and every cell in his body seemed to be screaming for answers that his mind couldn't formulate. Brandon, on the other hand, looked equally lost. He remained where he was, as if he were rooted to the ground, his shoulders tense, his lips slightly parted, still marked by the kiss they had shared. He raised his hand, running it through his hair in a nervous gesture, something so unusual that Sarah noticed it immediately. I don't know what to say," he began, his hoarse voice breaking the almost reverent silence. "Me neither," Sarah replied, her voice little more than a whisper. There was something hanging in the air between them, something neither of them knew how to name. It wasn't just desire, although it was impossible to deny that it was there. It was something deeper, more complex. It was the weight of everything they had experienced together up until that moment. The fights, the provocations, the shared moments of vulnerability, culminating in something that left them feeling helpless. Brandon took a tentative step toward her, his hands now stuffed into the pockets of his suit, as if he needed to restrain himself. "I never wanted it to happen like this," he said, the sincerity clear in his tone. Sarah frowned, not understanding. "Like this? In that impulsive way?" He stopped, taking a deep breath. "I'm not good at feeling, Sarah, no more. I spent so much time avoiding this, protecting myself, that now I don't even know how to deal with what I'm feeling." She felt her heart clench at his words. There was something deeply painful in the way he admitted this, as if every word was being forced out of him. "Brandon," she began, but he interrupted her, raising a hand as if asking for a moment to finish. "You need to understand that before you, I was comfortable. I had a routine. I did my job, kept my distance, avoided anything that could hurt me again. But then you showed up and messed everything up." He laughed softly, but there was a note of melancholy in his laugh. "And now here I am, breaking my own rule, because you make me want more than this safe routine, more than this empty life." His words hit her like lightning. For a moment, Sarah wondered if he knew the impact he was having on her, the way each confession seemed to crumble the walls she had built around herself. I don't know what to say," she admitted again, but this time there were tears threatening to form in her eyes. "You don't need to say anything," he replied, his voice softer now. "I just needed you to know." Silence fell between them again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a different kind of silence, one filled with unspoken emotions, with unasked questions, with possibilities that seemed endless and frightening at the same time. Finally, Sarah took a deep breath and took a step towards him. She looked at him, really looked, seeing not just the strong, confident man he presented to the world, but the vulnerable, scarred man who stood before her now. "I'm scared too," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "I don't know what that means. I don't know what happens after that. But I know you're not alone in this." Brandon closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing her words, letting each one penetrate the layers of defense he had built up over the years. When he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them, a softness, a hope that Sarah had never seen before. "You really are amazing, you know that?" he asked, a smirk appearing on his lips. Sarah laughed, quickly wiping away a tear that escaped. "You're not that bad yourself, Brandon Hayes." They stayed there for a few more minutes, just looking at each other, as if they were trying to memorize every detail of that moment. Then, almost without thinking, Brandon reached out his hand, and Sarah took it without hesitation. "Can I take you home?" he asked, voice low and hesitant. She nodded, lightly squeezing his hand in response. As they walked together out of the gallery, the cool night air enveloped them. The city seemed quieter than usual, as if it was giving them a moment of peace before the chaos of reality caught up with them again. In the car, the silence continued, but this time it was a comfortable silence. A silence that spoke more than words could. When Brandon parked in front of Sarah's building, he turned off the engine but made no move to get out. "Sarah," he began, turning to her. She looked at him, waiting. "I don't know how this is going to work, but I want to try." She felt a smile appear on her lips, a small but meaningful smile. "Me too." He nodded, and for a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other. Then, without thinking twice, Sarah leaned in and kissed him again, a kiss less urgent than the first, but full of promise and a kind of hope they had both forgotten was possible. When she finally got out of the car, Brandon watched her enter the building before driving away, feeling something new and strange inside him. For the first time in years, he felt no fear of what came next. He felt like facing this head-on, for her, and maybe even for himself. The sun had just risen in Los Angeles, but the tension in LA Horizons was already palpable. The team was in full swing preparing for the exhibition's final event, which promised to be the culmination of months of work. The gallery's main hall sparkled with the golden light that entered through the large windows, reflecting on the frames of the carefully arranged works. Sarah was at the center of the chaos, giving instructions to assistants and reviewing layout details with a clipboard in hand. Despite her calm exterior, she felt constant pressure. That morning, she and Brandon had agreed to go over the final adjustments before opening the doors to the city's elite. However, since the night before, something had been bothering Sarah. Leonard Krause. His presence at the recent event still lingered in her mind like an unwanted shadow. Something about the way he moved around the gallery, the way he observed the pieces, seemed premeditated. It was like he was up to something, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. As she was checking the invitations at reception, she felt a light touch on her shoulder. She turned to find Brandon, wearing a dark blue blazer and with the serious expression he reserved for moments of greater concentration. "We have a problem," he said, bluntly. Sarah held her breath. "What happened?" Brandon gestured for her to follow him. They walked together to a makeshift control room at the back of the gallery, where the projection and sound equipment for the main installation was located. Upon entering, Sarah saw one of the screens showing an error. The visual projection of the central installation was completely out of sync. "It wasn't like this yesterday," Brandon said, pointing to the screen. "And from what the technical team said, someone tampered with the systems overnight." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Do you think it was sabotage?" "I see no other explanation." Brandon crossed his arms, eyes fixed on the screen. "The installation is the centerpiece of the exhibition. If this fails, the entire event will be compromised." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "What about security? Didn't the cameras record anything?" Brandon ran a hand over his face, clearly frustrated. "That's what's weirdest. The cameras were off between 2 and 4 in the morning. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." Leonard's name immediately popped into Sarah's mind. She looked at Brandon, who seemed to be thinking the same thing. "Leonard was here last night," she said, her voice low. Brandon frowned. "I know. He was one of the last to leave, but we can't accuse him without proof." "We don't need to accuse anyone right now," Sarah replied, the determination in her voice growing. "We need to fix this before the event starts." Brandon nodded, his posture changing from frustration to focus. "All good. You take care of the projection team. I'll check the security systems again. We have 4 hours until the doors open." The two separated, diving into their tasks with the urgency of someone who knew that every minute counted. Sarah gathered the projection team, who were just as perplexed by the problem as she was. As they discussed solutions, she realized that the sabotage had been meticulous. Someone had not only disrupted the system, but had also inserted code that altered the visual patterns of the installation, making it impossible to simply restart it. With time running out, Sarah made the decision to manually reprogram each section of the facility. It was exhausting work, but necessary. As she typed commands and adjusted parameters, she could hear the muffled sound of Brandon in the hallway, instructing someone with the authoritative tone she had learned to respect. As the hours passed, the main hall began to come to life again. The installation was restored little by little, the visuals coming back into line with the music composed to accompany the projections. Sarah could feel the sweat running down her back, but she didn't allow herself to stop for even a second. Brandon returned to the room after a while, wearing a calmer expression. "The cameras have been restored and security is doubled. We will have no more interruptions." "Great," Sarah replied without looking away from the screen. "If I can finish this, the installation will be ready in the next 30 minutes. He was silent for a moment, watching her work. Despite the chaos, there was something almost mesmerizing about the way Sarah dedicated herself to the task. She was completely immersed, her eyes shining with determination and her hands moving with precision. Brandon felt a rush of admiration, mixed with something deeper that he couldn't yet name. "You're amazing," he said suddenly, his voice lower than usual. Sarah paused for a moment, looking up at him. The intensity in Brandon's gaze made her breathless for a moment, but she quickly shook her head, trying to get back to work. "I don't have time for compliments right now, Brandon." He smiled slightly. "I just wanted you to know." Finally, with minutes to spare, Sarah finished the last adjustment. The installation shined on the screen perfectly. The visuals synced with the sound impeccably. She let out a sigh of relief and looked at Brandon, who nodded approvingly. "We did it," she said, exhausted but satisfied. "We did it," he repeated, with a slight smile. The event began without any further mishaps, and guests soon filled the gallery with murmurs of admiration and enthusiasm. The main installation was an absolute success, captivating the attention of everyone who witnessed it. Sarah and Brandon moved around the room, talking to journalists and critics, but always aware of each other. In a moment of pause, Sarah spotted Leonard Croce observing the installation with an unreadable expression. He approached her, a shallow smile plastered on his face. "Congratulations, Sarah. It seems like everything went very well, despite the small challenges." She kept her smile, but there was a defiant gleam in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Krause. We have a great team. Nothing goes unnoticed around here." Leonard tilted his head, as if evaluating his words, before walking away to speak to another guest. Sarah felt Brandon approach, his presence immediately making her relax. "He won't stop," Brandon said quietly, his eyes following Leonard. "Then neither do we," Sarah replied firmly. The two shared a look filled with determination and something more. Something that said that whatever challenges came their way, they would face it together. The closing day of the exhibition dawned with a clear sky, the intense blue contrasting with the brightness of the city lights that were beginning to go out. At LA Horizons, there was an almost palpable sense of anticipation. The works glowed under the carefully positioned lighting, each piece seeming to tell a story of its own. Sarah was in the main hall, adjusting the last details of an interactive panel. The subtle smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mixing with the fresh scent of flowers that adorned the corners of the space. Brandon was on the phone in the back of the room, speaking in a firm but controlled tone. He wore an impeccable black suit, his tie slightly loose, as if trying to maintain an air of relaxation amid the chaos of the organization. Sarah watched him for a moment, noticing how he seemed less distant than when she first met him. He was still intense and demanding, but there was a softness to his gestures, especially when his eyes met hers. Despite all the progress they made together, both at work and in their personal relationships, Sarah still carried a secret that kept her in a constant state of alert. Your fan page dedicated to Alex Reyes. She knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. But what really worried her was how Brandon would react. He had already accepted the secret with more understanding than she expected, but the possibility of public exposure was a burden she dreaded bearing. As the afternoon progressed, guests began to arrive. Celebrities, renowned curators, and art critics passed through the glass doors, each bringing their own type of energy to the event. The sound of high heels on the marble floor mixed with laughter and the buzz of conversation, creating a vibrant soundtrack for the night. Sarah moved around the room with a professional smile, but her thoughts were racing. She knew the moment Alex Reyes arrived before she even saw him. The murmur in the hall immediately increased, and a wave of excitement swept through the space. When he entered, dressed in a light gray blazer over a black shirt, he seemed to radiate charisma. His presence was magnetic as always, and Sarah felt her stomach churn with nervousness. Brandon was next to her when Alex approached. He maintained his usual expression, a mix of professional interest and calculated composure, but Sarah noticed the slight tense in his shoulders. "Mr. Reyes," Brandon said, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to have you here again." "My pleasure," Alex replied, shaking his hand firmly before turning to Sarah. "And you, Sarah, always so involved in what she does." The look he gave her was warm, almost too personal, and Sarah felt her face heat up. "It's a privilege to be a part of this," she replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. "You were more than just part of it. I can see your touch in every detail of this exhibition." Sarah smiled, but her mind was a mess. She knew Alex had a way of making everyone feel special, but the intensity with which he looked at her seemed to indicate something more. As the night progressed, Sarah tried to avoid getting too close to Alex. She knew that her constant presence at his side could draw unwanted attention, especially from people like Leonard Krause, who still hovered around the gallery like a shadow. However, avoiding Alex proved impossible. Just before Brandon's speech, Alex asked for a moment on the main stage. The interactive installation glowed behind him, blue and gold light projections dancing to the soft soundtrack that filled the room. The audience turned to him, and Sarah, who was backstage adjusting a microphone, froze. "Before we officially begin tonight, I would like to say a few words," Alex began, his voice echoing throughout the room. Sarah felt butterflies in her stomach. She had no idea what he was about to say, but something about the way he looked directly at her made her catch her breath. "Over the past few months, I have had the privilege of working with some of the most dedicated and talented people I have ever met," he continued. "And while you all deserve recognition, there's one person in particular I would like to highlight." Sarah knew. Before he even finished, she knew. Heat rose to her face, and she wished she could disappear right then. Brandon, who was a few feet away from her, slowly turned around, his eyes fixed on her as Alex continued. "Sarah Carter," Alex said, with a smile that made all eyes turn to her. "As well as being a brilliant healer, Sarah is someone who has supported my career in ways I never imagined. I recently discovered that she is the administrator of one of the biggest fan pages dedicated to my work, and instead of feeling exposed, I feel honored." The room erupted in murmurs and applause, but Sarah could barely hear. Her heart was racing, and she could feel every gaze on her. Brandon, however, remained silent, watching her with an intensity she couldn't decipher. "Sarah, thank you for your passion, your support, and your dedication," Alex concluded. "You are an inspiration to us all." When he got off the stage, Sarah felt the urge to hide, but she knew that would only draw even more attention. Alex approached her, ignoring the guests who tried to talk to him, and enveloped her in a warm hug. "I'm sorry if I put you in a difficult position," he said, his tone sincere, "but you deserve to be recognized." "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice a little shaky. When Alex walked away, Brandon finally approached. There was something about his posture that seemed even more rigid than usual, but his eyes had a softness that surprised her. "Well, it looks like your secret isn't a secret anymore," he said, with a smirk. "It's not," Sarah replied, trying to keep her tone light but unable to completely hide her anxiety. Brandon was silent for a moment before adding, "You handled it well. And to be honest, he's right. Your passion is inspiring." Sarah felt her heart race again, but this time it wasn't because of Alex or the audience. It was because of Brandon, because of the way he was looking at her now, like he was seeing something he hadn't noticed before. "Thank you," she said, with a small smile. The two remained there, side by side, as the night continued around them. Despite the whirlwind of emotions, Sarah felt a strange sense of relief. Her secret was exposed, but somehow she no longer felt afraid, not with Brandon by her side. The night after the big event was a mix of celebration and restlessness. The gallery lights still glowed as the last guests said their goodbyes, but the room seemed quieter now, as if the weight of emotions had finally settled on everyone involved. Brandon, standing near the main door, watched the stream of people disappear into the darkness of the night. He had fulfilled his role, interacted with the most influential figures, and ensured that every detail of the event was impeccable. But the satisfaction that normally accompanied success was absent. Instead, there was something inside him that bothered him. It was the image of Sarah, standing in the center of the room, surrounded by praise, applause, and admiring looks. She looked more confident than ever, shining in the spotlight as the centerpiece of the entire exhibition. Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that her moment had disarmed him in a way he wasn't prepared to face. He tried to ignore the discomfort as he gave final instructions to the cleaning crew and checked the last logistical details, but his mind kept going back to the scene he had witnessed. The way Alex Reyes had praised her publicly, Sarah's smile, the sparkle in her eyes, it all followed him like an insistent shadow. When the room finally emptied, Brandon returned to his office. The space was silent except for the faint sound of the air conditioning, and the smell of new paper and cold coffee still hung in the air. He loosened his tie and threw himself into the chair, running his hands over his face. Every interaction with Sarah seemed to leave him more confused, more vulnerable. He knew Alex Reyes' attention to her was genuine, but the idea that someone else would recognize something so special about her before he did made him uneasy. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed unaffected by the revelation of her secret. After recovering from the initial shock, she embraced the moment with the grace and determination Brandon had come to expect from her. He saw her interact with guests, journalists, and even Leonard Krause, always with a calm confidence, and that only made him question his own feelings more deeply. While Brandon was lost in these thoughts, a knock on the door brought him back to reality. He looked up, surprised to see Sarah standing there, still dressed in the same elegant dress from the evening. His hair was a little disheveled, and there was a gleam of tiredness mixed with something else in his eyes. She held a cup of coffee in her hand, and the fresh aroma filled the room. "Are you hiding here?" she asked, walking in before he could respond. "I'm not hiding," he replied, straightening up in his chair. "Just collecting my thoughts." She smiled slightly, but there was something incisive in her gaze. "You've been acting weird all night." "Strange?" He raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "I guess I'm just tired, like everyone else after an event like this." "No, it's not tiredness," she insisted, approaching the table. "You've been distant. Something is bothering you, Brandon." He looked away, but the silence that followed only confirmed Sarah's suspicions. She sat in the chair across from him, placing the cup on the table. "So what is it? Let's go. It's not like you're known for hiding your opinion." Brandon let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the back of his neck as he tried to find the right words. "It's about you and Alex." Sarah blinked, clearly surprised. "Alex? What about him?" "I don't know. I guess I didn't like the attention he gave you tonight." The admission came out hesitantly, but sincerely. Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her expression a mix of incredulity and curiosity. "Are you jealous?" Brandon looked at her, and for a moment, the silence between them was so heavy it seemed to fill the entire room. Finally, he shook his head, laughing softly but without humor. "Perhaps. Or maybe it's something worse." "Worse?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm feeling, Sarah, but I know that every time I see someone like Alex approach you, I feel like I'm missing out on something I don't even know if I have the right to want." His words hung in the air, and Sarah felt heat rise in her chest. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. There was something so raw and vulnerable about Brandon's confession that it completely disarmed her. "Brandon," she started, but he interrupted her. "That's why I'm trying to get away," he said, his voice low, almost desperate. "Because if I allow myself to feel that way, I don't know if I can ever go back." Sarah was silent for a moment, processing what he had said. Then, slowly she stood up and walked over to him, stopping next to his chair. Brandon looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You won't move away," she said, her voice firm but soft. "I won't let you." He frowned, clearly confused. "Sarah, No, listen to me." She bent down slightly, getting to his level. "We've been through so much together. We work side by side. We face challenges. We create something incredible here. I won't miss this. I won't lose you." Brandon felt something tighten in his chest. Her words were simple, but filled with an emotion he didn't know how to deal with. He shook his head, as if trying to protect himself. "What if I end up hurting you? Then you'll have to deal with it," she replied, with a slight smile. "Because I'm not going anywhere, Brandon." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for something. And finally, he let out a heavy sigh, as if he was surrendering. "You really are stubborn, you know that?" "I prefer to think of myself as determined," she replied, her smile growing. Brandon laughed softly, and for the first time that night, he seemed relaxed. He raised his hand and lightly touched her arm, a small gesture, but full of meaning. "Thank you, Sarah, for not letting me sink. That's what partnerships are for, right?" she replied, feeling the warmth of his hand on her skin. They stood there, in the comfortable silence that only two people who truly understand each other can share. And as the clock continued to tick, Brandon realized that, for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to run away. The night of the event had been an absolute success. LA Horizons was in every newspaper and cultural website. Described as the epicenter of contemporary art in Los Angeles, the central installation, which was nearly sabotaged, was hailed as a revolutionary work, and Sarah's curation received praise she never imagined she would hear. But while everyone around her celebrated, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and emptiness. It was as if, upon reaching the culmination of the project that had consumed months of her life, she was suddenly adrift, not knowing where to go next. The gallery hall was almost empty now. Only the last members of the team remained, taking care of the final details. The soft light from the lamps cast golden tones on the white walls, giving the room a calm, almost melancholic air. The smell of the flowers that decorated the space still hung in the air, mixed with the light aroma of wine left by the glasses spread out on trays. Sarah was leaning against one of the columns, observing the space as if trying to commit every detail to her memory. She heard firm footsteps behind her and knew who it was before she even turned around. Brandon. He always seemed to emerge in those moments, as if he was able to sense when she needed someone by her side, even if she didn't admit it. "Last survivors," he said with a slight smile, handing her a glass of water. Sarah accepted, smiling back. "It seems so. I guess I didn't realize how tired I was until now." Brandon leaned against the pillar beside her, his shoulders relaxed but his eyes still filled with something Sarah couldn't quite identify. He seemed distant, like he was thinking about something he didn't know how to say what it was. She asked, tilting her head. He hesitated for a moment, before shaking his head. "Nothing. I was just thinking about how this was all possible. Months ago, I didn't think the gallery would survive. And now, we are here." Sarah smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made him realize she was also thinking about more than just the gallery. "You did it, Brandon. You brought the gallery back to life." "It wasn't just me," he corrected, his voice low. "You were the heart of it all, Sarah. Without you, I don't know if I would have made it." She felt her face heat up and looked away, trying to hide the emotion his words aroused. "I just did what had to be done." "No," he insisted, turning to face her. "You did much more than that. You reminded me of what passion is, what it is to believe in something. And that is something I will never forget." Sarah felt the weight of his words, but before she could respond, Brandon sighed and straightened up. "I need to show you something." Curious, she followed him to the upper floor of the gallery, where there was a room that was rarely used. Brandon opened the door and turned on the light, revealing a screen covered in white cloth. The smell of fresh paint filled the room, and Sarah caught her breath. "Are you painting again?" she asked, her voice full of surprise and wonder. Brandon nodded, but there was a nervousness in his movements that she had never seen before. "It was difficult at first, but something about you inspired me. You and the way you see art. No rules, no limitations, just emotion." He pulled back the cloth, revealing the painting. It was an abstract portrait, full of vibrant colors that seemed to move on the canvas. Shades of red, gold, and blue danced together, creating something that seemed alive. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes taking in every detail. "It's amazing, Brandon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's you," he replied, and Sarah froze. She turned to him, eyes wide. "That's how I see you. Not how you are, but how you make me feel, how you brought color back into my life." Sarah felt a wave of emotions wash over her. His words, combined with the intensity of the painting, left her floored. But at the same time, she noticed something in the way he looked away, as if he were hesitant to say more. "Brandon," she began, but he raised his hand as if to interrupt her. "You don't need to say anything," he said, his voice low. "I just wanted you to know." But Sarah didn't want to let it go. She knew he was trying to hide something, perhaps out of fear or insecurity. And for the first time, she felt it was her turn to fight for him, just as he had fought for her so many times. "Brandon, She hesitated, trying to find the words. "You gave me so much more than I could ever ask for. And to see that, to know what you feel, means more to me than I can express." He finally looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to burn. But before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward and grabbed his hand. "I don't want you to keep hiding," she said. "Not from me, not from yourself, because what we have here is something worth fighting for." The silence that followed was charged but not uncomfortable. Brandon squeezed her hand lightly, as if allowing himself to believe her words. In the days that followed, Sarah made her own decision. She knew that keeping her fan page active no longer made sense to her. Alex Reyes had been an important part of her life, but now she needed space to grow. Closing the page was an emotional process, but when she clicked the final button, she felt something close to freedom. While Sarah moved on with her professional life, Brandon continued to paint. He found a new energy in his work, and the gallery became both an exhibition space and a home for his renewed creativity. And despite everything, they both knew they were just beginning to discover what they meant to each other. The success of the exhibition seemed to radiate through the streets of Los Angeles, echoing in articles, social media, and comments from industry insiders. For LA Horizons, that moment marked a definitive turning point. Critics hailed Sarah's impeccable curation and the artistic boldness that Brandon had brought to the gallery, consolidating it as a cultural epicenter in the city. However, at the heart of this triumph, there was something much more personal at play. Something that Sarah and Brandon were still trying to understand. The morning after the event, Sarah arrived at the gallery earlier than usual. The sun had not yet fully risen, and the sky was tinged with orange and violet. The fresh air carried a faint scent of flowers mixed with the smell of freshly washed asphalt. Inside the gallery, the silence was welcoming, interrupted only by the sound of their footsteps on the marble floor. Sarah felt a mix of relief and melancholy. Everything was going well, but inside, something seemed to change. She entered her office, where a stack of reports waited. Instead of getting to work, he opened his laptop and accessed the fan page he had been secretly managing for years. Art Soul 98's profile was a reflection of years of dedication, a passion that had started as an escape and turned into something much greater. She scrolled through the posts, reading comments from other fans who shared her enthusiasm for Alex Reyes. Now, however, keeping that page seemed out of place. The public revelation at the event had stripped her of the anonymity she cherished. But it was more than that. She felt like she was ready for something new, something that wasn't defined by her role as a fan. Sarah took a deep breath, her finger hovering over the delete button. When he clicked, he felt a mix of relief and sadness, as if he was closing an important chapter in his life. But at the same time, she knew it was necessary to make room for the next one. Meanwhile, Brandon was in his apartment. It was a simple, functional space, but full of personal touches. Unfinished paintings were leaning against the walls, and the smell of fresh paint hung in the air, mixed with the woodsy scent of his cologne that seemed to permeate the room. He was in front of a canvas, his eyes fixed on an abstract portrait he had been working on for the last few days. The painting was full of movement and vibrant colors: red, gold, blue, tones that seemed to capture emotions rather than concrete forms. It was the second piece he had made since he started painting again, but this one was special. He knew he couldn't pass up the opportunity to express what he felt, even if it was through art. The brush in his hand hesitated for a moment before touching the canvas again, adjusting a minute detail. The morning light illuminated the space, revealing paint stains scattered across the floor and the clothes he wore. Brandon was so immersed in his work that he barely noticed the time passing. When he finally finished, he took a step back, observing the result. He saw Sarah in the painting, not as a literal image, but as an essence, a whirlwind of passion, determination, and heat that seemed to bring life to the space around her. He knew he needed to show her, but the fear of appearing vulnerable made him hesitate. That afternoon, Brandon took the piece to the gallery. The sky was clear, and the sun shone brightly, reflecting off the glass windows of the surrounding buildings. He carried the painting carefully, his heart beating fast as he thought about what he would say to Sarah. When he arrived at the gallery, he found her in the main hall, rearranging some pieces from the exhibition. "Sarah," he called, his voice a little lower than usual. She turned around, surprised to see him. Her eyes immediately went to the painting he was holding, and she raised her eyebrows curiously. "What is that?" "Something I wanted to show you," he replied, walking over to her. Brandon placed the painting against one of the walls and with a simple gesture, revealed the canvas. Sarah held her breath. The explosion of color seemed to pulse with life, a combination of chaos and harmony that captured something she didn't know could be represented. She took a step forward, eyes scanning every detail, trying to take in what was before her. "It's amazing, Brandon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what does it mean?" He hesitated for a moment before taking a deep breath and speaking. "It means you. It's about what you brought into my life. About how, before you, everything seemed empty. No color, no movement. But then you showed up, and everything changed." His words hit her like lightning. She looked at him in surprise, emotion clearly visible on her face. Brandon looked away, as if trying to hide his own vulnerability, but Sarah took a step toward him. "Brandon," she began, but he interrupted her. "I don't know what that means, Sarah," he said, his voice low, "but I needed you to know. I need you to understand the impact you had on me." She felt a wave of emotion wash over her, but she knew this wasn't the time to pressure him. Instead, he smiled, a small but meaningful smile. "I understand, Brandon, and that means a lot to me." They sat in silence for a moment, both processing what had been said and what was yet to be said. Sarah knew Brandon was struggling with his own fears, and she didn't want to rush him. But at the same time, he felt that something fundamental between them had changed. That night, Sarah returned home feeling lighter. She knew she was ready for a fresh start, both in her career and her personal life. Closing the fan page had been an important step, but what really drove her now was the connection she shared with Brandon. As for Brandon, he spent hours in the apartment, looking at the canvases he had painted and thinking about Sarah. He knew he couldn't ignore how he felt anymore, but the idea of opening himself up completely still scared him. However, for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he was ready to try. The closing night of the exhibition arrived with a mix of celebration and nostalgia. The doors of LA Horizons were open for another memorable night, but this time there was something more intimate in the air. The glow of the gallery lights reflected off the windows, and the Los Angeles sky was clear, dotted with stars that seemed to have risen to witness the end of a journey that had transformed everyone involved. Sarah was in the main hall, adjusting a final detail on one of the works. She wore a simple yet elegant navy blue dress that seemed to highlight the intensity of her eyes. The faint scent of fresh flowers wafted through the air, mixing with the subtle smell of paint from the freshly touched up walls. She took a deep breath, taking in the energy of the space that, in so many ways, had become her home over the past few months. Guests were already beginning to enter, greeting her with smiles and words of admiration. Sarah maintained a calm, professional air, but inside, her heart was racing. Something in his intuition told him that tonight would be different, that something was about to change. Brandon arrived soon after. He wore a classic black suit but no tie, a touch that softened his usual formality. When he entered, his eyes immediately found Sarah. For a moment, he stopped, watching her from afar. She seemed so at ease, moving with grace among the guests, that he wondered how he had managed to live so long without realizing what she meant to him. The night continued with the usual dynamics of events like that: speeches, greetings, toasts. But for Brandon, everything seemed on the back burner. He felt a weight in his chest, an urgency that he could no longer ignore. He knew he couldn't let that moment pass without saying what had been trapped inside him for so long. Later, as the room began to empty, Brandon found her in the corner where the central installation still glowed with its vibrant lights. Sarah had her back to him, watching the projections on the wall, her arms crossed. There was something contemplative in his posture, as if he were absorbing everything that the exhibition represented. "Thinking about the next project?" he asked, his soft voice interrupting the silence. Sarah turned around, a small smile appearing on her lips. "Something like that. It's hard not to think about everything that happened here. It feels surreal that it's ending." "It's not over," Brandon corrected, taking a few steps closer. "It's just changing." She tilted her head, assessing him. "You sound almost philosophical." He gave a sideways smile, but there was something serious in his eyes. "I have learned a lot in the last few months. About art, about myself, and above all, about what really matters." Sarah was silent, waiting for him to continue. The brightness of the lights reflected in his eyes, and she could see the internal struggle he was having. Brandon took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she had learned to recognize. "I'm scared, Sarah," he admitted, voice lower now. "I'm afraid to say what I'm feeling, because if I say it, it becomes real. And if it becomes real, I don't know if I'll be good enough for it." She felt her heart sink when she heard those words. It was rare to see Brandon so vulnerable, so exposed. "Brandon," she began, but he raised his hand as if asking for a moment to finish. "I never thought I could feel anything like this again. After everything that happened, I had convinced myself that I didn't need those things anymore. But then you showed up, and little by little, you tore down every wall I built. I tried to resist. I tried to move away, but I can't do it anymore, Sarah." Her eyes were full of tears now, but she didn't let them fall. "Instead, you stepped forward, taking his hands in yours. You've never been a man to back down from a challenge, Brandon. Don't start now." He laughed softly, but there was a sadness in his laugh. "What if I fail? What if I disappoint you? So we deal with it together," she replied, without hesitation. "Because I'm not going anywhere, and I know you don't either." The silence between them was charged, but there was something different now. Brandon felt a wave of relief, as if those words had lifted a weight from his shoulders. He looked at her, his eyes filled with something he couldn't name, but that felt right. "I love you, Sarah," he said finally, the words coming out as a whisper but carrying truth. She felt the tears flow this time, but they weren't from sadness. They were of relief, of happiness. "I love you too, Brandon." He pulled her closer, enveloping her in a hug that seemed to unite all the pieces that were once fragmented. The smell of his perfume was familiar, and she felt safer than she had ever felt before. When their lips met, it was as if the world around them disappeared. There were no more galleries, guests, or worries, just the two of them. Later that night, as the gallery lights dimmed and silence took over the space, Brandon and Sarah stood together in the empty room. They didn't need words at that moment. Just each other's presence was enough. They knew the road ahead would not be easy. Both carried baggage, scars, and insecurities, but for the first time, they were ready to face everything together. And in that space that had witnessed so much growth and transformation, they promised to do the same for each other, to grow, transform, and create something beautiful from all that they were and could be. The gallery was plunged into profound silence. The lights had been dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of the central facilities illuminating the space. The night in Los Angeles seemed to have slowed down, as if the world outside was waiting for Brandon and Sarah to close an important chapter. They were in the center of the room, surrounded by works that had witnessed their evolution, as professionals, as people, and now as something more. Brandon still held Sarah's hands, his thumbs tracing soft circles on her skin. An almost imperceptible gesture, but full of meaning. He watched her with an intensity that made her heart race, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of her face. The sparkle in his eyes, the one that always seemed to hide something, was now completely exposed. "You have no idea how hard it was to get here," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but full of emotion. "I spent so long convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that I was better off alone. And you came into my life and messed everything up." Sarah laughed softly, but there were tears in her eyes. If I had known, I would have tried to be more careful. No, I wouldn't have. Brandon smiled. That sideways smile she knew so well. And that's exactly what I love about you. You're not careful, Sarah. You are intense, passionate. You believe in things with all your heart. And I didn't know I needed this until I met you. His words hit her like a wave, and she felt her eyes fill with tears again, but she didn't look away. Not this time. She knew Brandon was giving himself completely to her in that moment, and she was determined to do the same. I'm not going to apologize for messing up your life, Brandon, because you messed up mine too, but in a way that made me want to be better. That made me want to believe that there is more than just work and responsibilities. You gave me something I didn't know I was looking for. Brandon let out a low laugh, filled with relief. Then there are two of us. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Sarah, I don't know how this is going to work. I don't know if I'll be good at this, but I know I don't want to spend another day pretending like you're not the most important thing in my life. The tears finally escaped her eyes, but Sarah smiled. It was a wide, sincere smile that lit up his face in a way that made Brandon's heart sink. Then don't pretend anymore, Brandon. Just let me be with you. We can figure it out together. He raised a hand, touching her face gently. I don't deserve you. It's not about deserving, it's about wanting. And I want you, Brandon. Those words seemed to release something inside him. Without hesitating any longer, Brandon leaned in and kissed her. But this time it wasn't like the kisses they had shared before, filled with hesitation or tension. This one was full of certainty. It was a kiss that said everything they hadn't yet found the words to express. When they finally broke apart, they were both out of breath but laughing softly, as if they were sharing a secret that no one else in the world could understand. I won't let you go, he said, his voice low but firm. I don't want you to let me go, she replied, grabbing him by the back of the neck and bringing him in for another hug. The connection between them was so palpable that it seemed to fill the entire space around them. Later that night, when the gallery was completely empty, Brandon and Sarah walked down the halls side by side. The lights still flickered softly in the premises, and the smell of polished wood and dried flowers accompanied them. They talked about everything and nothing at the same time, their low voices echoing through the empty space. At one point, Brandon stopped in front of one of the pieces. It was his painting dedicated to Sarah. He looked at her in a way that made her heart beat faster. You know this is just the beginning, right? He asked. I know, she replied, her voice full of confidence. And I couldn't imagine a better start. He smiled again, but there was something else in his smile now. Hope, maybe even happiness. I will never stop painting you. You gave it back to me, Sarah. You gave me everything back. She felt the weight of his words, but instead of responding, she held his hand. The simple gesture said more than anything she could say. As they walked out of the gallery together that night, the cool air of Los Angeles enveloped them, filled with the distant scent of jasmine and the faint murmur of the city that never slept. But to them, the world seemed perfectly calm. Every step they took felt like a silent promise that whatever the future brought, they would face it together. And as they walked down the sidewalk, their hands intertwined in the soft light of the streetlights, they both knew that what they had found wasn't just love. It was the certainty that, in each other's hands, they had found the inspiration to create something truly beautiful, in art, in life, and in the heart.